The baby's cry pierced through the Dakota wind like a knife through silence. Ethan Cole had heard many sounds in his years riding these endless plains: wolves howling, thunder cracking, men dying, but nothing like this. Nothing so small, so desperate, so utterly alone. He found them in the tall grass, a woman collapsed, lips cracked and bleeding, and an infant wailing with hunger beside her mother's unconscious body. In that moment, Ethan faced a choice that would shatter his solitary existence forever. This is their story. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city below so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The sun hung merciless in the afternoon sky, turning the Dakota prairie into a sea of golden grass that shimmered with heat waves. Ethan Cole had been riding for 3 days straight, his horse's hooves raising small clouds of dust with each tired step. The leather reins felt rough in his calloused hands, and sweat trickled down his back beneath his worn shirt. He was heading to Elkhorn Ridge, a small settlement where he planned to collect wages for a cattle drive he'd completed 2 weeks prior. The journey should have been uneventful, just him, his horse Dakota, and the vast empty sky. But then he heard it. At first, Ethan thought it was a bird, some prairie hawk or falcon crying out for its mate. But as Dakota's ears twitched forward and the sound came again, carried on the hot wind, Ethan's entire body went rigid. That wasn't a bird. That was a human cry. A baby's cry. He pulled Dakota to a halt, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle secured to his saddle. Out here, sounds could be deceptive. He'd heard stories of bandits using every trick imaginable to ambush lone travelers. But this cry, it came again, weaker this time, more desperate, cut through every defensive instinct he had. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured to his horse, dismounting slowly. His boots hit the packed earth, and he stood perfectly still, listening. The wind rustled through the grass, creating waves of gold and green that stretched to the horizon. And there, about 50 yards to his right, the crying continued, intermittent now, as if whatever strength fueled it was running out. Ethan's jaw tightened. He led Dakota forward, moving through the grass carefully, his eyes scanning for any sign of danger. The seed heads brushed against his legs, whispering secrets only the prairie knew. The crying grew louder, more distinct, and with it came a sound that made his blood run cold: silence. Not the peaceful silence of an afternoon, but the terrible silence of someone who'd stopped breathing. He broke into a run. The grass parted before him like a curtain, and there, in a small depression where the earth dipped slightly, he found them. A woman lay motionless on her side, her dark hair matted with sweat and dirt, her face so pale it looked like alabaster against the brown earth. Her dress was torn and stained, her feet bare and bloodied, but it was the tiny bundle beside her that seized Ethan's attention. A baby, no more than a few months old, wrapped in what had once been a blue shawl, but was now gray with dust and stains. The infant's face was red from crying, her tiny fists waving weakly in the air, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for water. The sound that came out was barely a whimper now, the earlier cries having exhausted what little strength she possessed. "Jesus," Ethan breathed, dropping to his knees beside them. He touched the woman's neck first, searching for a pulse, and relief flooded through him when he found it. Faint, rapid. But there. She was alive. Barely. He turned his attention to the baby, scooping her up with hands that suddenly felt too large and clumsy for such a delicate task. The infant was so light, so impossibly small. Her skin felt hot beneath his palms, and her crying had dissolved into weak, hiccuping sounds that tore at something deep in his chest. "It's all right, little one," he said softly, though he had no idea if anything would be all right. "I've got you." The baby's eyes, a startling blue even in her distressed state, focused on him with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so young. Her crying quieted slightly, as if she recognized that someone, finally, had come. Ethan looked down at the woman again. She hadn't stirred at all. Her breathing was shallow, her lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. How long had they been out here? A day? 2? The evidence told a grim story. The woman's condition, the baby's desperate state, the complete absence of any supplies or shelter. They'd been abandoned, left to die. Rage flared in Ethan's chest, hot and sudden. What kind of person left a mother and child to perish in the wilderness? But anger wouldn't help them now. Action would. He stood, cradling the baby against his chest with one arm while he quickly shrugged out of his coat with the other. The heavy canvas duster had seen him through countless storms and cold nights. Now it would serve a different purpose. He wrapped the infant in it carefully, creating a cocoon that would protect her from the sun and provide some comfort. The baby's crying had stopped completely now. She gazed up at him with those impossibly blue eyes, her tiny hand somehow finding its way to his thumb and gripping it with surprising strength. Something shifted in Ethan's chest. A feeling he couldn't name, didn't want to name, but couldn't ignore. "Stay with me," he whispered to her. Then, louder, as if the force of his words could somehow anchor the woman to life, "Both of you stay with me." Dakota stood waiting patiently, trained well enough not to wander. Ethan approached with the baby secured in his coat, speaking low and calm to his horse. "We've got company, boy. Need you to be gentle." Getting the woman onto the horse would be the hardest part. Ethan knelt beside her again, positioning the bundled baby carefully in a small hollow in the grass where she'd be safe for a moment. The infant watched him with wide eyes but didn't cry. It was as if she understood somehow that he was trying to help. "Ma'am," Ethan said, touching the woman's shoulder gently. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response. Her head lolled to the side when he shook her slightly, revealing a nasty bruise along her jawline that made his anger flare again. Someone had hit her. Hard. There was no time for gentleness. Ethan slid his arms beneath her knees and shoulders, lifting her as carefully as he could manage. She was lighter than he expected, her body limp and burning with fever. Her head fell against his shoulder, and he could feel the heat radiating from her skin even through his shirt. Getting her onto Dakota required strength and balance. The horse stood perfectly still, bless him, while Ethan maneuvered the unconscious woman into position across the saddle. It wasn't dignified, but it would work. He secured her as best he could, then retrieved the baby from the grass. The infant had started crying again, soft mewling sounds that spoke of hunger and discomfort. Ethan held her close, feeling helpless in the face of her need. He had no milk to give her, no way to ease her suffering except to get her to help as fast as possible. "I know," he murmured, climbing into the saddle behind the woman's unconscious form. "I know you're hungry. We're going to fix that." With the baby cradled in one arm and his other hand managing the reins and keeping the woman steady, Ethan urged Dakota into a careful walk. Elkhorn Ridge was still 5 miles away, at least an hour's ride at this pace, maybe more. Every minute counted. The sun continued its merciless assault as they moved across the prairie. Ethan kept checking the woman's breathing, terrified each time that he'd find it had stopped. The baby alternated between crying and an exhausted silence that was somehow worse. Once, she managed to get her tiny fist into her mouth and sucked desperately at it, breaking Ethan's heart. "Almost there," he lied, because what else could he say? The prairie stretched endless in every direction, beautiful and terrible in its vastness. Ethan had always loved this land, its freedom, its wildness, its honest cruelty. But now, with these two fragile lives depending on him, it felt like an enemy. Every minute that passed was a minute closer to losing them. Dakota's steady gait ate up the miles, but not fast enough. Never fast enough. Ethan found himself talking, filling the silence with words he didn't even know he possessed. "There's a doctor in Elkhorn Ridge," he said to the unconscious woman, to the crying baby, to himself. "Doc Morrison. He's a good man. Served in the war, seen everything. He'll know what to do." The baby's crying intensified, her tiny face scrunching up with the effort. Ethan adjusted his hold, bringing her closer to his chest where his heartbeat might offer some comfort. It seemed to help, marginally. Her crying softened to weak whimpers. "You're a fighter," Ethan told her. "Both of you are fighters. I can tell." The woman's fever seemed to be getting worse. He could feel the heat of her even through the layers between them. Dehydration, exposure, possibly infection from whatever injuries she'd sustained. The list of dangers was long. But she was still breathing. That was something. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing in strange ways. Ethan marked their progress by landmarks he knew: a distinctive rock formation, a dry creek bed, a lone cottonwood tree that had somehow survived generations on the open plain. Each one brought them closer to salvation. The baby had gone quiet again, and this time Ethan felt real fear. He shifted his arm to look down at her face. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow. She was shutting down, her tiny body conserving what little energy it had left. "No," Ethan said sharply. "No, you don't give up. You hear me? We're almost there." He urged Dakota into a faster walk, then a trot, balancing speed against the risk of jostling his passengers too much. The woman remained unconscious, her body moving limply with the horse's motion. The baby made no sound at all. Finally, the buildings of Elkhorn Ridge appeared on the horizon. It wasn't much of a town, a main street with perhaps 20 structures, most of them wood-frame buildings weathered gray by the sun and wind. But it had a doctor, a general store, and a small boarding house. Right now, that made it the most important place in the world. Ethan guided Dakota straight down the main street, aware of the curious stares from the few people out in the afternoon heat. He must have made quite a sight, a dusty cowboy with an unconscious woman draped over his saddle and a baby wrapped in his coat. "Doc Morrison!" he called out as he approached the small building with a hand-painted sign reading "Medical Office." "Doc Morrison, I need you!" The door opened before he'd even dismounted. Isaac Morrison was a man in his 50s, gray-haired and stocky, with the calm competence of someone who'd seen the worst humanity had to offer and had learned how to patch it back together. He took one look at Ethan's burden and snapped into action. "Bring them inside," he said, holding the door wide. "What happened?" "Found them on the prairie," Ethan said, dismounting carefully with the baby while Morrison helped ease the woman down. "Been out there at least a day, maybe more. She's fevered. The baby's starving." Together they carried the woman inside and laid her on the examination table. Morrison immediately began his assessment, checking her pulse, her breathing, lifting her eyelids to examine her pupils. "Martha," he called toward the back of the building, "I need you." A woman appeared, Morrison's wife, who often assisted with his medical work. She was a sturdy woman with kind eyes and capable hands. She took one look at the scene and understood immediately. "The baby needs milk," Ethan said urgently, still holding the small bundle. "She's been crying for hours. I don't know how long since she was fed." Martha reached for the infant, and Ethan found himself reluctant to let go. The baby's tiny hand was still gripping his thumb through the coat. But Martha's face was kind and knowing, and finally he released his grip. "I'll take care of her," Martha promised. "We'll get some milk into her right away." She disappeared into the back room, and Ethan turned his attention back to Morrison, who was examining the woman more thoroughly now. He'd discovered the bruise on her jaw, and his expression had darkened. "Someone did this to her," Morrison said quietly. "It wasn't a question. That's what I figured." "Any idea who she is? Where she came from?" Ethan shook his head. "Found her and the baby about 5 miles out, just lying in the grass. No supplies, no horse, nothing. They were abandoned." Morrison worked in silence for a moment, his hands gentle as he checked for broken bones and other injuries. "She's severely dehydrated," he said finally, "and this fever is concerning. I'm going to need to get fluids into her, cool her down. She's got some cuts and scrapes, but nothing that looks too serious. The bigger worry is what's happening inside. Infection, heat stroke, could be anything." "Will she make it?" Morrison met his eyes. "I don't know, son, but I'll do everything I can." From the back room came the sound of the baby crying again, but this time the cry was stronger, more indignant. It was the cry of a child who was being cared for, whose immediate needs were being met. The sound of it loosened something tight in Ethan's chest. "The baby?" he asked. "She's feeding," Martha called out. "Poor little mite is starving, but she's taking the milk well. She'll be all right." Ethan moved to a chair against the wall and sat down heavily, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. His arms ached from holding the baby, his back hurt from the awkward position of keeping the woman steady in the saddle, and his throat was dry from the heat and dust. But more than physical exhaustion, he felt emotionally drained, as if the intensity of the last few hours had wrung something vital from him. Morrison worked steadily, methodically. He cleaned the woman's wounds, applied cool compresses to bring down her fever, and carefully administered water drop by drop between her cracked lips. She didn't wake, but her breathing seemed to grow steadier under his care. "There's a story here," Morrison said without looking up from his work. A bad one, I'd wager. Yeah, Ethan agreed. I'd wager so too. You planning to stick around? Find out what it is? The question surprised Ethan. He'd been so focused on getting them to safety that he hadn't thought beyond this moment. His original plan had been to collect his wages and move on. Maybe head north toward Montana, find work on one of the big ranches up there. He had no ties to Elkhorn Ridge, no reason to stay. Except now there was a woman who might wake up alone and terrified, and a baby who'd already seemed to know his face. I'll stay until she wakes up, Ethan heard himself say. Make sure they're all right. Morrison glanced at him, a slight smile touching his weathered face. That's good of you. Was it? Ethan wasn't sure. It felt less like goodness and more like inevitability, as if the moment he'd heard that baby crying in the grass, his path had been altered in ways he couldn't yet understand. The afternoon wore into evening. Martha brought the baby out, cleaned and fed and wrapped in a soft blanket. The infant was sleeping now, her tiny face peaceful in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten. Martha laid her in a small basket lined with cloth, positioning her where they could all keep an eye on her. She's a beautiful child, Martha said softly. Someone loved her enough to dress her well before whatever happened. It was true. Despite the dirt and the wear, the baby's clothing had been well made, carefully sewn. Someone had cared for this child, which made her abandonment all the more incomprehensible. The woman on the table stirred for the first time as the sun was setting, a low moan escaping her lips. Morrison was at her side immediately, speaking in low, soothing tones. Easy now, he said. You're safe. You're in Elkhorn Ridge, in my medical office. You're safe. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. She tried to sit up, panic flooding her features, but Morrison's gentle hand on her shoulder kept her still. My baby, she gasped, her voice rough and barely audible. Where's my baby? Right here, Martha said quickly, bringing the basket close. She's right here, and she's fine. See? Sleeping peacefully. The woman's eyes found the basket, found the small sleeping form within, and tears began streaming down her face. She reached out with a shaking hand, her fingers barely brushing the baby's blanket before her strength gave out, and her arm fell back to her side. Thank you, she whispered, her eyes closing again. Thank you. Don't try to talk, Morrison said. You need rest. We'll explain everything when you're stronger. But her eyes opened again, this time searching the room until they found Ethan, still sitting in his chair against the wall. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. This woman whose name he didn't know, whose story was still a mystery, and the cowboy who'd stumbled upon her in the grass. You, she said, her voice barely more than a breath. You found us. Ethan stood, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance. Yes, ma'am. My Lucy. You saved my Lucy. Martha did that, Ethan said, nodding toward the doctor's wife. I just got you here. No. The woman's eyes were intensely focused now, despite her weakened state. You came. You heard her crying, and you came. Others would have ridden past. The weight of what she wasn't saying hung in the air. Someone had ridden past. Someone had left them there to die. Well, Ethan said awkwardly, I couldn't do that. A small smile touched the woman's cracked lips. No, she said. I don't suppose you could. Her eyes closed again, and this time she slipped into a deeper sleep, her breathing regular and more peaceful than before. Morrison checked her pulse and nodded with satisfaction. She'll sleep now, he said. Best thing for her. When she wakes, she'll need food and more water, but I think she'll recover. And the baby? Ethan asked. Healthy as far as I can tell. Hungry and dehydrated, but nothing that good care won't fix. Martha smiled at Ethan. You did a good thing today, Mr. Cole. Ethan Cole. Well, Mr. Cole, you saved 2 lives today. That's not nothing. Ethan looked down at the sleeping baby, at the woman whose name he now knew was Clara, whose daughter was Lucy. He thought about the moment he'd heard that cry piercing through the wind, about the choice he'd made to investigate rather than ride on. Such a small choice, really, such enormous consequences. What happens now? He asked. Morrison exchanged a glance with his wife. Now, We care for them until they're strong enough to move on. And we try to find out what happened, why they were out there alone. Someone will come looking, Martha added quietly. Someone always does, with stories like these. There was a warning in her words, Ethan realized. Whatever had happened to Clara and Lucy, whatever had led to them being abandoned on the prairie, it probably wasn't over. There would be complications, consequences, possibly danger. The smart thing would be to collect his wages and leave town before any of that caught up with them. The smart thing would be to walk away from this situation that was clearly complex and potentially dangerous. He'd done his good deed. He'd saved their lives. That was enough. Except when he looked at Lucy sleeping peacefully in her basket, when he remembered the feel of her tiny hand gripping his thumb, when he thought about Clara's eyes meeting his across the room with such desperate gratitude, he knew he wouldn't leave, not yet. I'll need a room, Ethan said. Somewhere I can stay for a while. Morrison smiled as if he'd expected nothing less. Mrs. Henderson runs the boarding house 2 doors down. Clean rooms, fair prices. Tell her I sent you. Night had fallen properly now, the prairie beyond the town's few lights becoming an ocean of darkness. Ethan stepped outside for a moment, letting the cool air wash over him. Dakota was tied to the hitching post, still patient, still waiting. Ethan stroked the horse's nose, drawing comfort from the familiar. We're staying, boy, he said quietly. Don't ask me why, but we're staying. Above him, stars were beginning to emerge, thousands upon thousands of them scattered across the vast sky. Out on the prairie, Ethan had always found the stars comforting, proof that there was something larger than himself, larger than the day's troubles and triumphs. Tonight they seemed different, like witnesses to the choice he'd made, to the path he'd stepped onto without fully understanding where it would lead. Inside the medical office, 2 lives hung in balance, not between death and survival anymore, but between past and future, between whatever horrors had brought them to that grass and whatever possibilities lay ahead. And somehow, inexplicably, Ethan Cole found himself woven into their story, his own solitary path intersecting with theirs in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. He thought about the moment he'd found them, about Clara's unconscious form and Lucy's desperate cries. He thought about the rage he'd felt at their abandonment, the fear that had gripped him during the ride to town, the strange sense of rightness when Lucy's hand had found his thumb. Something had changed in those hours. Something fundamental had shifted in the bedrock of who Ethan Cole was and what he wanted from this life. He'd always been a loner, content with his own company, answerable to no one. The prairie suited him because it asked nothing and gave nothing, a perfect match for a man who expected the same from life. But now, standing in the darkness outside Morrison's medical office, Ethan felt the stirrings of something different. A sense of responsibility, yes, but more than that. A sense of purpose that went deeper than simply collecting wages and moving on to the next job. He'd saved them. That was true. But maybe in some way he didn't yet understand, they might save him too. The door opened behind him and Martha stepped out. She's sleeping peacefully, she reported. Both of them are. You should get some rest yourself, Mr. Cole. You've had quite a day. Yes, ma'am, Ethan agreed. But he didn't move, not yet. Martha came to stand beside him, looking out at the dark prairie with him. You're wondering what you've gotten yourself into, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Something like that. Well, I can't tell you what's ahead, but I can tell you this. What you did today mattered. Whatever comes next, that will always be true. Ethan nodded slowly. It would have to be enough, this moment of certainty, because he had a feeling that everything else was about to become very complicated indeed. Finally, he untied Dakota and led him toward the livery stable, making arrangements for the horse's care. Then he made his way to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, secured a room, and climbed the narrow stairs to the small chamber that would be his home for however long this lasted. The room was sparse but clean. A bed, a washstand, a single window looking out onto the main street. Ethan sat on the bed without bothering to light the lamp, letting the darkness embrace him. His coat was still at Morrison's office, wrapped around baby Lucy. He'd get it back eventually, but for now he liked the idea of it there, keeping her warm, keeping her safe. Sleep should have come easily after the exhausting day, but Ethan lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the small town settling into night. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere a door closed. Somewhere Clara and Lucy slept, healing from whatever had brought them to the edge of death. And somewhere possibly closer than anyone knew, the person or people responsible for their suffering might be wondering if they'd survived, might be planning their next move, might be coming. Ethan's hand moved unconsciously to the knife he kept in his boot, the rifle he'd propped against the wall. He was a man of the frontier, trained by hard experience to expect trouble and prepare for it. Whatever was coming, and he was increasingly certain something was coming, he would be ready. For Clara, for Lucy, for reasons he couldn't fully explain even to himself. The night deepened, and finally, Ethan's eyes closed. His last conscious thought was of a baby's cry cutting through the wind, calling him to a destiny he'd never imagined, never wanted, and now couldn't imagine refusing. Tomorrow would bring questions and answers, complications and choices. But tonight, in this small room above Elkhorn Ridge's quiet main street, Ethan Cole slept the sleep of a man who'd done what needed doing, cost what it may. And in Morrison's medical office, wrapped in a cowboy's coat, a baby girl named Lucy dreamed innocent dreams, unaware that the rough-handed stranger who'd lifted her from the grass had just become the most important person in her young life. The story was just beginning. Morning light filtered through the window of Ethan's room, and he woke with a start, momentarily disoriented. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back. The cry in the grass, the desperate ride to town, Clara and Lucy fighting for their lives. He dressed quickly, splashing water from the basin on his face, and headed downstairs. Mrs. Henderson was in the kitchen, a rail-thin woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She looked up as Ethan appeared. "Coffee's on the stove," she said. "And I heard what you did yesterday. Whole town's talking about it." Ethan poured himself a cup, the bitter warmth spreading through him. "They all right?" "Doc Morrison came by early this morning, said the woman's awake and asking for you. The baby's doing well, drinking like she's making up for lost time." Mrs. Henderson paused, studying him over the rim of her own cup. "You planning to stay involved in this, Mr. Cole?" It was a fair question, asked without judgment. Ethan had been asking himself the same thing all night. "For now," he said simply. The boarding house keeper nodded as if that confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Well, you'll need breakfast then. Can't face the day on an empty stomach." She set about making eggs and bread while Ethan drank his coffee in silence. Other boarders began filtering down. A railroad surveyor, a traveling salesman, a young couple heading west, all of them casting curious glances at the cowboy who'd brought the mysterious woman and child to town. Ethan ignored them, his mind already at Morrison's office. After eating quickly, he made his way down the street. The morning was cool, promising another hot day ahead. A few early risers were opening shops, sweeping boardwalks, going about the mundane business of keeping a frontier town alive. It all felt strangely normal after yesterday's urgency. Morrison's office door stood open, and Ethan stepped inside to find the doctor writing notes at a small desk. He looked up and smiled. "Right on time," Morrison said. "She's been asking for you since dawn." "How is she?" "Stronger. The fever broke during the night, and she's kept down some broth. Still weak as a kitten, but she'll recover." Morrison set down his pen. "She wants to talk to you, but Ethan, be gentle. Whatever happened to her, it wasn't good." Ethan nodded and moved toward the back room where he could hear Martha's soft voice. The doctor's wife was sitting beside the examination table, now converted into a makeshift bed, with Lucy's basket on a chair nearby. Clara was propped up on pillows, looking fragile but alert. Her dark hair had been brushed and braided, and someone had dressed her in a clean nightgown. But it was her eyes that caught Ethan's attention. Brown eyes that held too much knowledge, too much pain for someone who couldn't be more than 25. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice still hoarse but clearer than yesterday. "Please, come in." Martha stood. "I'll give you some privacy. I'll be just outside if you need anything." When they were alone, save for sleeping Lucy, an awkward silence fell. Clara broke it first. "I don't know how to thank you," she began. "You saved our lives. If you hadn't found us—" "You don't need to thank me," Ethan interrupted, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Clara said firmly. "Not anyone. They didn't." Her hands twisted in the blanket covering her. They rode right past us. I was conscious enough to see them, 2 riders, maybe 3 hours before you came. I tried to call out, but my voice was gone. They looked right at us and kept riding. The rage Ethan had felt yesterday flared again. Who were they? I don't know. I couldn't see their faces clearly. Everything was blurred. She paused, gathering strength. But you stopped. You heard Lucy crying, and you came. That makes you different from most men I've known. Ethan pulled up the chair Martha had vacated and sat down, his hat in his hands. Ma'am, Clara, I need to understand what happened, how you ended up out there alone. Her face closed off, fear flickering across her features. For a moment, Ethan thought she wouldn't answer. Then Lucy made a small sound in her sleep, and Clara's expression softened. For her, she said quietly. I'll tell you for her, because you deserve to know what you've gotten yourself into. She took a deep breath. My name is Clara Whitmore. I was born in Philadelphia, married at 18 to a man named Marcus Whitmore. He was older, established, respected. My father thought it was a good match. Was it? Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. For the first month, maybe. Clara's voice was steady but emotionless, as if she were recounting someone else's story. Then I learned what Marcus was really like. He had a temper, you see, and he believed a wife was property, something to be controlled and disciplined. The bruise on her jaw suddenly made terrible sense. Ethan's hands tightened on his hat, but he said nothing, letting her continue at her own pace. I endured it for 2 years, tried to be the perfect wife, thinking if I just did everything right, he'd stop. But men like Marcus don't stop. They only get worse. She looked at Lucy's basket. Then I found out I was pregnant, and something changed in me. I realized I couldn't let my child grow up in that house, watching what he did to me, learning that love looked like violence. So you left, Ethan said. I tried to. The first time he found me within a day. The punishment for that? She trailed off, and Ethan saw her hand unconsciously move to her ribs. The second time I was 8 months pregnant. I got as far as New York before he tracked me down. He was more careful that time. Nothing that would show. Nothing that would risk the baby. He wanted an heir, you see. Lucy, Ethan said softly. Clara nodded. I gave birth to her 3 months ago, and the moment I held her, I knew I had to try again. I couldn't let her grow up thinking a man's fists were normal, that fear was what a home should feel like. How did you end up in Dakota? Marcus had business out west, something to do with railroad investments. We came by train to Deadwood, and I saw my chance. I'd been planning, saving small amounts of money whenever I could, hiding them in Lucy's things where he'd never look. A woman in Deadwood helped me. Mrs. Chen, she ran a boarding house. She gave me supplies, arranged for me to join a wagon train heading to Montana. But you didn't make it to Montana, Ethan observed. Clara's face darkened. No. 3 days into the journey, Marcus found us. I don't know how. Maybe he paid someone. Maybe he just got lucky. He rode into camp one night, all smiles and explanations. Told everyone I was his wife, that I'd run away because of female hysteria after the baby, that he was taking me home for my own good. And they believed him, Ethan said, disgust in his voice. Why wouldn't they? He's a respectable businessman, well-dressed, well-spoken. I was just a hysterical woman with a newborn. The wagon master wouldn't go against him. Her voice cracked slightly. Marcus didn't even wait until we were out of sight. He hit me right there in front of them, said he was disciplining his property. No one intervened. Ethan felt sick. How did you get away again? I didn't, not at first. He took us back toward Deadwood, but he was so angry, so drunk on his own righteousness. We stopped to camp that first night, and he drank himself into a stupor. I waited until he was unconscious, took Lucy, and ran. I didn't have supplies, didn't have a horse, just ran into the darkness with my baby. Into the prairie, Ethan said, understanding now. I walked all night, all the next day. I thought if I could just get far enough, if I could reach another town, I could find help. But there was nothing out there, just grass and sky and heat. I ran out of water by the second day. Lucy was crying, and I couldn't feed her properly, couldn't give her what she needed. Tears were streaming down Clara's face now. I tried to keep going, but my body just gave out. The last thing I remember was lying down in the grass, holding Lucy, and praying that someone kind would find her even if I didn't make it. She looked at Ethan then, her eyes raw with emotion. You were the answer to that prayer. You were the someone kind. Ethan didn't know what to say. The story was worse than he'd imagined, and he'd imagined plenty during the long night. He thought about the men who'd ridden past them, about the wagon master who'd let Marcus take her, about a system that treated women as property and called it civilization. He's going to come looking, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Clara whispered. He'll never stop. Marcus doesn't accept defeat, and he sees Lucy as his possession. He'll come. Let him, Ethan said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. Let him come to Elkhorn Ridge asking for his wife. He'll find things are different here. Clara shook her head. You don't understand. Marcus is powerful, connected. He'll bring the law on his side, claim I kidnapped his daughter, that I'm unfit. He'll make himself the victim, and people will believe him because that's what people do. They believe men like Marcus. Not everyone, Ethan said firmly. Doc Morrison knows what he saw yesterday. I know what I found in that grass. Martha knows a beaten woman when she sees one, and I'll be damned if I let him take you or Lucy back to that life. Why? Claire asked, her voice breaking. Why do you care? You don't know us. We're nothing to you. Ethan stood, moving to look down at Lucy in her basket. The baby was awake now, her blue eyes tracking movement with growing awareness. She'd filled out even in one day of proper feeding, her cheeks less hollow, her skin less feverish. When Ethan extended his finger, she grabbed it with that surprising strength babies possessed. I heard her crying, he said simply. I can't unhear it, and I can't walk away knowing what's waiting if Marcus finds you. Clara was quiet for a long moment. You're a good man, Ethan Cole, she said finally. But goodness isn't always enough against men like my husband. He'll destroy you if you stand in his way. He can try, Ethan said. The door opened and Morrison stepped in, ending the heavy conversation. I hate to interrupt, but Clara needs rest. And Ethan, there's someone here to see you. Ethan followed the doctor out front to find Sheriff Thomas Wade waiting, a burly man in his 50s with a weathered face and shrewd eyes. He extended his hand to Ethan. Mr. Cole, heard what you did yesterday. Good work. Just happened to be riding through, Ethan said, shaking the offered hand. Lucky for the lady and her baby. Wade's eyes were calculating. Doc filled me in on some of the details. A husband possibly tracking her. That about right? That's right. Well, I like to know what kind of trouble might be heading into my town. You got a description of this Marcus Whitmore? Ethan looked to Morrison, who nodded. Clara said he's tall, maybe 6 feet, dark hair graying at the temples, well-dressed, probably traveling with money and authority. Wade wrote this down in a small notebook. And if he shows up here demanding his wife? You tell him she's under medical care and can't be moved, Morrison said firmly. Which is true, by the way. She's in no condition to travel. And after she recovers, Wade pressed, after she recovers, she can make her own choices, Ethan said. Free woman in a free territory, far as I'm concerned. Wade studied him for a long moment. You planning to stay in Elkhorn Ridge, Mr. Cole? For a while. Good. Because if trouble does come, I'd rather have a man like you on the right side of it. Wade tipped his hat. Keep me informed, Doc. And Mr. Cole? Welcome to town. After the sheriff left, Morrison turned to Ethan. You meant what you said in there? About standing between Clara and her husband? I did. Then you need to understand something. Men like Marcus Whitmore don't fight fair. They use the law, social pressure, money, whatever works. You'll need more than good intentions. What do you suggest? Morrison was quiet for a moment, thinking. First, we establish Clara and Lucy's presence here officially. I'll register them as patients under my care. Wade can note them in the town records. We create a paper trail that shows they came here of their own accord, seeking help. And when Marcus claims otherwise, we make sure Clara has allies, witnesses, people who can testify to her state when she arrived, to the evidence of abuse. Morrison met Ethan's eyes. And we make sure she has means to support herself so Marcus can't claim she's dependent on him. She has no money, Ethan pointed out. No, but she could have employment. Martha could use help here at the office, especially with patients like Lucy who need regular care. It's not much, but it's legitimate work, legitimate income. The plan was taking shape, and Ethan felt a surge of something like hope. What else? You need to understand the legal situation. Dakota Territory has laws about marriage and property, but they're complicated. If Marcus can prove they're legally married and Lucy is his biological daughter, he has rights. We can fight those rights, but it takes time and money. I have money, Ethan said. Not a fortune, but enough. My wages from the cattle drive, plus some savings. Morrison looked surprised. You'd spend your money on this? On them? Ethan thought about the question. A week ago, his money had meant freedom, the ability to drift where he wanted, work when he chose, answer to no one. Now it meant something different. It meant the ability to help, to make a stand, to be something more than just another cowboy passing through. Yes, he said. I would. The doctor smiled. Then we might just have a chance. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Ethan collected his wages from the cattle company's agent in town, then settled into work helping at the livery stable, honest labor that kept him in Elkhorn Ridge and gave him a reason to stay that didn't raise questions. Each morning he'd visit Morrison's office to check on Clara and Lucy. Each evening he'd return, often bringing small things, flowers from the prairie, a toy he'd carved from wood, news from town. Clara grew stronger daily. By the end of the first week, she was sitting up for extended periods, feeding Lucy herself, even walking short distances with support. The bruises faded, the cuts healed, and color returned to her face. But the fear in her eyes never quite disappeared, especially when unfamiliar riders came through town. Lucy thrived. Under Martha's care and her mother's love, the baby transformed from the desperate, crying infant Ethan had found into a happy child who smiled readily and gurgled with delight when Ethan appeared. He found himself looking forward to those smiles more than he wanted to admit. She knows you, Clara said one evening, watching as Ethan held Lucy with increasing confidence. She lights up when you arrive. She's a smart girl, Ethan replied, bouncing Lucy gently. Knows who brought her to safety. No, Clara said softly. She knows who cares about her. Babies can sense these things. The comment hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Ethan focused on Lucy, letting the moment pass. But the moments were accumulating, building into something larger. The way Clara's face relaxed when he entered the room, the way she'd begun asking his opinion on small decisions, the way his days now revolved around visiting hours at Morrison's office instead of planning his next destination. Martha noticed, of course. You're getting attached, she told him one afternoon while Clara was napping and Ethan was holding Lucy. Just making sure they're all right, Ethan said defensively. Martha smiled knowingly. And that's why you carved that rattle for Lucy and brought Clara that book of poetry, just making sure they're all right? Ethan felt heat rise in his face. She needed something to read. Gets boring lying in bed all day. She did need something to read, Martha agreed, and it was thoughtful of you to provide it, just as it was thoughtful of you to pay Doc Morrison's fees without telling Clara, and to arrange with Mrs. Henderson for a room for them once Clara's well enough to leave here. How did you— Small town, Ethan. People talk. Martha's expression grew serious. I'm not criticizing. What you're doing is kind and generous, but I want you to think about something. What happens when Marcus does show up? Because he will, sooner or later. And when he does, you'll be standing between a man and what he considers his property. That's a dangerous place to be. I know, Ethan said quietly. Do you? Because I've seen men like you before, good men who think they can fix everything with courage and good intentions. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it just gets people hurt. Lucy chose that moment to grab Ethan's nose, making him smile despite the heavy conversation. What would you have me do? Walk away? No, Martha said firmly. I'd have you stay, but with your eyes open. Understand what you're taking on. Clara's not just a woman who needs temporary help. She's a woman with a dangerous past and an uncertain future. Lucy's not just a baby who needed rescuing. She's a child who will need a father figure, protection, stability. If you're going to be that for them, you need to be sure. because starting and then leaving would be worse than never starting at all. The words struck home. Ethan looked down at Lucy, at her trusting blue eyes and her tiny hand wrapped around his finger, and felt the weight of Martha's warning. What was he doing? He was a cowboy, a drifter, a man whose longest stay in any town had been 3 months. What did he know about being a father figure, about providing stability, about any of this? But then he remembered finding them in the grass, remembered Clara's gratitude and Lucy's desperate cries, remembered the feeling of rightness when he'd decided to stay. Maybe he didn't know what he was doing. Maybe this was all a terrible idea, but walking away felt impossible. I'm sure, he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Martha studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Then you'd better prepare. Because the easy part, the rescuing, is over. Now comes the hard part. Now comes building something worth protecting. She was right, of course. By the second week, Clara was well enough to leave the medical office. Ethan had arranged everything: a small room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, supplies for the baby, a position for Clara helping Martha with light medical tasks once she was fully recovered. He'd spent nearly all his savings, but watching Clara walk into that clean room with Lucy in her arms, seeing her tears of gratitude, made every penny worth it. I'll pay you back, Clara said for the 100th time. I swear, Ethan, I'll find a way. You don't owe me anything, Ethan interrupted. Just focus on getting stronger and taking care of Lucy. I owe you everything, Clara said quietly. My life, my daughter's life, a chance at a future I never thought I'd have. They were standing in the small room, barely larger than Ethan's own, with a bed, a cradle Morrison had provided, a washstand, and little else. Sunlight streamed through the window, and Lucy was cooing happily in her mother's arms, unaware of the emotional current flowing between the adults. Clara, Ethan began, then stopped, unsure what he wanted to say. She saved him from his awkwardness. Will you stay in Elkhorn Ridge, now that we're settled? It was the question he'd been avoiding. His work at the livery was temporary, meant to give him a reason to remain while Clara recovered, but she was recovered now, or near enough. There was no logical reason for him to stay longer, except logic had nothing to do with it. I thought I might stick around a while longer, Ethan said carefully. Job market's not great right now anyway. Might as well wait for better opportunities. Clara's smile told him she saw through the excuse, but she didn't call him on it. I'm glad. Lucy would miss you if you left. Just Lucy? The question was out before Ethan could stop it. A blush colored Clara's cheeks. Not just Lucy, she admitted softly. The moment stretched between them, full of possibilities and dangers neither was quite ready to name. Then Lucy demanded attention with a loud gurgle, and they both laughed, the tension breaking. Over the following days, a pattern emerged. Ethan would finish his work at the livery and stop by Mrs. Henderson's to check on Clara and Lucy. Sometimes they'd take walks through town, Ethan carrying Lucy while Clara built up her strength. Sometimes they'd sit in the small parlor of the boarding house, talking about everything and nothing. Ethan's life on the trail, Clara's childhood in Philadelphia, dreams they'd had that had been derailed by circumstance. I wanted to be a teacher, Clara confessed one evening. Before Marcus, before all of this. I loved books, loved learning. I thought I'd teach children, help them discover the world through stories. You still could, Ethan said. Elkhorn Ridge could use a proper school. Right now, kids just learn what their parents can teach them. Clara looked at him with something like wonder. You really think I could? Why not? You're educated, you're good with Lucy. I've seen how patient you are. You'd make a fine teacher. The idea clearly appealed to her. For the first time since Ethan had found her, Clara's eyes held something other than fear or gratitude. They held hope. But hope was a fragile thing in a world where Marcus Whitmore existed. 3 weeks after Ethan had found Clara and Lucy in the grass, the danger they'd been preparing for arrived in Elkhorn Ridge. Ethan was at the livery when he heard the commotion, a fine carriage pulling up in front of Morrison's office, expensive horses snorting and stamping. He moved to the doorway and felt his blood run cold. The man who stepped from the carriage matched Clara's description perfectly. Tall, well-dressed in an expensive suit despite the dust of travel, dark hair graying at the temples, an air of authority and wealth surrounding him like cologne. Marcus Whitmore had arrived. Sheriff Wade was already approaching, and Ethan quickly crossed the street to join them. Marcus was speaking to Morrison, who'd emerged from his office. "My wife and daughter," Marcus was saying, his voice cultured and reasonable. "I've been searching for them for weeks. I was told they might be here receiving medical care?" Morrison's face was carefully neutral. "I have a patient matching that description, yes." "Wonderful." Marcus's smile was all charm. "I've been so worried. Clara hasn't been well since the baby was born. Some kind of hysteria. She wandered off in Deadwood, and I've been frantic trying to find her." "That's an interesting story," Wade said, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Differs somewhat from what we've heard." Marcus's eyes sharpened as he took in the sheriff's badge, then shifted to Ethan. "And who might you be?" "Ethan Cole. I'm the one who found your wife and daughter." "Then I'm in your debt, sir," Marcus said smoothly. "How did you come across them?" "Lying unconscious in the prairie grass about 5 miles from here. No supplies, no water, no horse. Left to die." Marcus's expression flickered, just for a moment, before the mask of concern returned. "How terrible. Clara must have been more confused than I realized. She must have wandered much farther than I thought." "Or she was running," Ethan said bluntly, "running from someone." The temperature of the conversation dropped noticeably. Marcus's smile became fixed, dangerous. "I don't appreciate your tone, Mr. Cole. Whatever lies my wife has told you—" "I haven't heard any lies," Ethan interrupted. "Just facts. Facts about bruises and fear and a woman desperate enough to walk into the wilderness with an infant rather than stay with her husband." Marcus's veneer of civility was cracking. "My relationship with my wife is none of your concern. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to see Clara and my daughter." "She doesn't want to see you," Morrison said quietly. "I don't care what she wants," Marcus snapped, his true nature emerging. "She's my wife. The child is mine. I have every legal right." "You have the right to stay away from them," a new voice said. Clara had emerged from the boarding house, pale but determined, with Martha standing protectively beside her. Lucy was safely inside with Mrs. Henderson, kept away from the confrontation. Marcus's face transformed at the sight of her, fury and possessiveness warring with the need to maintain his public image. "Clara, darling, you've been ill. Let me take you home where you can properly recover." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Clara said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm not your wife anymore, Marcus. I left you. I choose to stay here." "You don't get to choose," Marcus said, his voice low and threatening. "You belong to me. The child belongs to me. You'll come with me now, or I'll make you wish you had." Ethan stepped between them. "That's enough." Marcus looked at him with pure hatred. You've been filling her head with ideas, haven't you? Convincing her she can defy me. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" "A man who beats women," Ethan said flatly. "A man who abandons them in the wilderness. A man who's about to learn that those things don't play well in Dakota territory." "I have rights," Marcus hissed. "Legal rights. She's my wife under the law." "Pennsylvania law, maybe," Wade interrupted. "But out here things work differently, and I tend to believe a woman who shows up beaten and half dead over a man who shows up in an expensive suit making demands." Marcus's hand moved toward his coat, and Ethan's hand dropped to his gun. The moment hung there, tense and dangerous, before Marcus seemed to realize he was outnumbered and outgunned. He stepped back, his smile returning but colder now, calculated. "Very well," he said. "If that's how you want to play this, we'll play it legally. I'll return with proper documentation of our marriage, proof of my paternity, and a court order if necessary. And when I do, Sheriff, you'll have no choice but to hand them over to me. And you," he looked at Ethan, "you'll learn what happens to men who interfere in matters that don't concern them." He climbed back into his carriage, and within moments, the expensive vehicle was rolling out of Elkhorn Ridge, leaving a cloud of dust and tension in its wake. Clara was trembling. Ethan moved to her side, and she gripped his arm for support. "He'll be back," she whispered. "He'll come back with the law, and they'll make me go with him." "No," Ethan said firmly. "That's not going to happen." But even as he said it, he saw the doubt in Clara's eyes, the fear that had been her companion for so long, and he knew that Marcus's threat wasn't empty. The man had resources, connections, the weight of law and society on his side. Fighting him would require more than good intentions. It would require strategy, sacrifice, and possibly a solution none of them had yet considered. As Clara leaned against him, as the sun set over Elkhorn Ridge, Ethan felt the full weight of the promise he'd made settle onto his shoulders. He'd saved them once. Now he had to find a way to save them again, this time from a danger that couldn't be defeated with a rifle or a fast horse. This time, the battle would be fought with law and legitimacy, with witnesses and documentation, with every resource Ethan could muster. And at the center of it all was a question he hadn't dared to fully form until now. How far was he willing to go to protect Clara and Lucy? What was he willing to sacrifice, to risk, to become? The answer came to him clearly as he stood there with Clara's weight against him, with the knowledge that Lucy was safe inside waiting for her mother's return. Everything. He was willing to risk everything. He just had to figure out how. The confrontation with Marcus cast a shadow over Elkhorn Ridge that no amount of sunlight could dispel. That evening, a meeting convened in Morrison's office. The doctor, his wife Martha, Sheriff Wade, Clara, and Ethan. Lucy slept peacefully in her cradle, unaware that her future hung in the balance. "He'll be back within 2 weeks," Wade said, pacing the small space. "Maybe less if he's got connections in territorial government. And when he comes, he'll have papers that say Clara Whitmore is legally his wife and Lucy is his daughter. In the eyes of the law, that gives him rights." "Rights to what?" Ethan demanded. "To beat her? To abandon her in the wilderness?" "I'm on your side, Cole," Wade said sharply. "But I have to enforce the law as it's written, not as I wish it was. A husband has legal authority over his wife. That's the reality we're working with." Clara sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale. "Then there's nothing to be done. He'll take me back, and everything Ethan did, everything all of you have done, will be for nothing." "There might be a way," Morrison said slowly. All eyes turned to him. "It's not ideal, and it would require sacrifice from everyone involved, but there is a legal avenue." "What avenue?" Clara asked. Morrison looked uncomfortable. "Marriage. If you were married to someone else, legally married, properly documented, Marcus's claim would be significantly weakened. He could argue your marriage to him is still valid, but it would take time to sort out in court. Time you could use to establish residency, build a case, gather evidence of abuse." The room fell silent. Ethan's heart was pounding, understanding where this was leading before anyone said it aloud. "Who would marry her?" Martha asked softly, though her eyes were already on Ethan. "It would have to be someone Marcus couldn't easily dismiss or intimidate," Morrison continued. "Someone established in the community with witnesses to attest to the legitimacy of the union. Someone willing to stand up in court and swear the marriage was entered into freely and in good faith." Clara was shaking her head. "No, I won't ask that of anyone. It's too much, too dangerous." "You're not asking," Ethan heard himself say. "I'm offering." Every head turned toward him. Clara's eyes were wide with shock. "Ethan, you can't," she began. "Why not?" He stood, his hands gripping the back of his chair. "Marcus is coming back with the law on his side. We need something equally legal to fight him with. A new marriage, witnessed and recorded, gives us that." "But you'd be binding yourself to a woman you barely know," Clara protested. "With a child who isn't yours, running from a dangerous man. Your whole life would change." "My life already changed," Ethan said quietly. "Changed the moment I heard Lucy crying in that grass. I can't go back to who I was before that, Clara. I don't want to." Wade was studying him carefully. "You understand what you'd be taking on? This isn't just a paper arrangement. If Marcus challenges this in court, you'll need to convince a judge that it's a real marriage. You'd be legally responsible for Clara and Lucy, and Marcus will try to destroy you, your reputation, your livelihood, maybe worse." "I understand." "And if the court sides with Marcus anyway, if they decide his marriage takes precedence, then at least we'll have fought," Ethan said. "At least we'll have tried every option before letting him take them." Martha moved to Clara's side. "It's your decision," she said gently. "No one can make it for you." Clara looked at Ethan for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something, doubt, perhaps, or ulterior motives, or the kind of possessive hunger she'd learned to recognize in Marcus. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't seem to find it. Instead, she found something else that made her eyes fill with tears. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for us?" Ethan crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. "Because when I found you in that grass, when I picked up Lucy and heard her crying, something in me shifted. I can't explain it better than that. You needed help, and I was there to give it. That hasn't changed." "This is more than help," Clara said. "This is your entire future." "Maybe my future is supposed to include you and Lucy," Ethan said simply. "Maybe that's why I was the one riding through that particular stretch of prairie on that particular day. I don't know, but I know I can't walk away and let Marcus take you back to that life. If marrying you is the way to stop him, then that's what we'll do." Tears were streaming down Clara's face now. "You're offering me a choice. Do you understand how rare that is? Marcus never gave me choices. He took them all away. But you're standing here asking what I want, giving me the power to decide my own future." "So what do you decide?" Ethan asked. Clara looked at Lucy, sleeping so peacefully, unaware of the adult machinations swirling around her. Then she looked back at Ethan, and something in her expression hardened into resolve. "I accept," she said clearly. "If you're truly willing, if you understand what you're taking on, then yes. I'll marry you, Ethan Cole." The decision made, events moved quickly. Wade knew a circuit judge who was due in Elkhorn Ridge within 3 days for routine hearings. Morrison began gathering documentation, his medical records of Clara's condition when she arrived, statements from Martha about the evidence of abuse, testimony from Ethan about finding them abandoned. They were building a case, creating a paper trail that would support their position if Marcus challenged the marriage. But privately, in the quiet moments when Ethan lay awake in his boarding house room, doubt crept in. What was he doing? He was a cowboy, a man who'd spent his adult life avoiding exactly this kind of commitment. Marriage, family, responsibility. These were anchors, and he'd always prided himself on being free to drift wherever the wind took him. Yet when morning came and he saw Clara in the boarding house parlor, Lucy in her arms, he felt no regret, only a strange sense of rightness, as if all the drifting he'd done had been leading him to this moment, this choice, this chance to be something more than just a man passing through. Clara seemed to be wrestling with her own doubts. On the second day, as they walked together at the edge of town with Lucy bundled against the cool evening air, she finally voiced them. "You don't have to do this out of pity," she said quietly. "I want you to know that. If you've changed your mind, if you're having second thoughts—" "I'm not," Ethan interrupted. "But you should be," Clara insisted. "This is insane, Ethan. We've known each other less than a month. You're proposing to legally bind yourself to a woman with a violent husband, a baby, and no prospects. Any sane man would run." "Then I guess I'm not sane," Ethan said with a slight smile. Clara stopped walking, forcing him to turn and face her. Lucy gurgled happily between them, grabbing at the evening light as if she could catch it in her tiny fists. "I need you to understand something," Clara said seriously. "I'm grateful for what you're doing, more grateful than I can ever express. But I won't trap you in a marriage based on obligation and pity. If we do this, I need to know it's because you truly want to, not because you feel responsible for us." "I do feel responsible for you," Ethan admitted, "but that's not why I'm doing this. I'm doing it because when I think about Marcus taking you and Lucy away, when I imagine never seeing either of you again, something in my chest feels like it's being crushed. I'm doing it because Lucy's smile is the first thing I think about when I wake up. I'm doing it because talking with you in the evenings has become the best part of my day." He paused, surprised by his own honesty. "I can't promise I'll be a good husband. I've never been married, never even thought seriously about it before. But I can promise I'll try. I can promise I'll protect you and Lucy with everything I have. And I can promise that this isn't pity, it's choice, my choice." Clara's eyes were shining with unshed tears. "I don't love you," she said bluntly. "I wish I could say I do, but I'd be lying. Marcus destroyed my ability to trust those feelings. I don't know if I can ever feel that way about any man again." "I'm not asking you to love me," Ethan said gently. "I'm asking you to let me stand between you and Marcus. The rest, whatever else might or might not develop between us. We can figure out as we go. That's not fair to you. Let me decide what's fair to me, Ethan said. You make your choice, I'll make mine. That's what partners do, isn't it? Make their own choices and then figure out how to make them work together? A small smile touched Clara's lips. Is that what we'd be? Partners? I'd like to think so, Ethan said. I know the law will say I'm your husband, that I have authority over you, but between us in private, I want us to be partners, equals. You have a voice in every decision that affects you and Lucy. That's my promise to you. Clara was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Marcus would have beaten me for suggesting such a thing. The idea that a wife should have equal say with her husband, he would have called it blasphemy. Marcus is a fool, Ethan said flatly, and he's not going to touch you ever again. The next evening, Martha took Clara aside to discuss what the marriage would mean practically. Ethan waited outside Morrison's office, trying not to eavesdrop but hearing occasional fragments through the window. Consummate the marriage, Martha was saying. If Marcus challenges this, a judge might ask, I know, Clara's voice quiet but steady. I understand what's expected. But after what you've been through with Marcus, Martha sounded concerned. Ethan is not Marcus, Clara said firmly. I know that, but I also know I'm not ready for that part of marriage. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. Have you told him? No. How do I tell a man who's sacrificing everything for us that I can't, that I might never be able to? You tell him the truth, Martha said gently. And if he's the man I think he is, he'll understand. Later that night, Clara found Ethan sitting on the steps of the boarding house, looking out at the star-filled sky. She sat beside him, Lucy asleep in her arms. Martha talked to you, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. She did. Clara took a breath. Ethan, if we do this, if we actually get married, you need to know that I can't. I'm not ready to be a wife in all the ways that means. Marcus, She stopped, struggling with the words. You don't have to explain, Ethan said quietly. I understand. Do you? Because I'm asking you to enter into a marriage that might never be a real marriage. You'd be bound to a woman who can't even stand the thought of... Her voice broke. Ethan carefully took Lucy from her arms, cradling the sleeping baby against his chest. The infant settled immediately, her tiny hand curling against his shirt. Look at me, Clara, he said. When she did, he continued. I'm not marrying you to get a woman in my bed. I'm marrying you to keep you and Lucy safe. Everything else, whether this marriage ever becomes what the church and society think it should be, that's something we figure out together, at your pace, if ever. There's no pressure from me. Not now. Not ever. But that's not fair to you, Clara protested. You're a man. You have needs. I have a need to do the right thing, Ethan interrupted. And the right thing is making sure you feel safe, not obligated. If that means this marriage stays in name only for the rest of our lives, then that's what it'll be. Your body is yours, Clara. Not Marcus's, not mine, yours. And no one gets to touch it unless you want them to. Clara was crying openly now. How are you real? How does a man like you exist after everything I've seen, everything I've experienced? I'm not special, Ethan said. I'm just a man trying to do better than the ones who came before me in your life. That's a pretty low bar, considering. A watery laugh escaped Clara. You're wrong. You are special. And I promise you, Ethan Cole, that even if I can't give you everything a wife should, I'll be the best partner I can be. I'll keep your home. I'll stand beside you. You'll heal, Ethan said firmly. That's all I need you to do. Heal from what Marcus did. Build a life where Lucy can grow up safe and happy. And maybe, if we're lucky, figure out how to be happy yourself. That's enough. That's more than enough. They sat in silence after that, passing Lucy back and forth as the night deepened around them. And somewhere in that quiet exchange, something shifted between them. Not love. Clara was right that she wasn't ready for that, might never be ready. But something foundational and real. Trust. The beginning of a partnership built on honesty rather than ownership, on choice rather than obligation. The day of the marriage arrived with autumn crispness in the air. Judge Willard Thornton was a stern man in his 60s who'd seen enough of frontier life to be skeptical of most things. He'd agreed to perform the ceremony in his temporary chambers, a room above the general store that served as his office when he was in town. Wade had spread word carefully, and the small room was packed with witnesses. Morrison and Martha, Mrs. Henderson, the livery owner where Ethan worked, several townspeople who'd watched Clara's recovery and believed her story. Their presence was strategic. The more people who could testify to the legitimacy of the marriage, the stronger their legal position. Clara wore a simple dress Martha had helped her make, pale blue, that brought out her eyes. She held Lucy, who was dressed in a white gown that Mrs. Henderson had contributed. Ethan wore his cleanest shirt and pants, his hair slicked back, feeling more nervous than he'd ever felt facing down a stampede. Judge Thornton eyed them both skeptically. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to be clear about something. I've heard rumors about why this marriage is happening, about a husband from back east who might contest it. I need to know this union is being entered into freely and in good faith, not as some legal maneuver." "It's both," Ethan said honestly. "Yes, Clara needs legal protection from her former husband, but I'm not standing here against my will. I want this marriage. I want to be Lucy's father and Clara's husband." "Mrs. Whitmore?" Thornton turned to Clara. "Or should I say, soon to be Mrs. Cole? Are you entering this marriage freely?" Clara looked at Lucy, then at Ethan, then back at the judge. "I am. Ethan has shown me more kindness in a month than I experienced in years of my first marriage. He's given me choices when I had none. Yes, I need his protection, but I also want his partnership. I'm choosing this freely." Thornton studied them both for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. Let's begin." The ceremony was brief and businesslike, stripped of romantic flourishes. Thornton read from a legal text, asking the required questions, receiving the required answers. When it came time for rings, Ethan produced 2 simple bands he'd had the blacksmith make. Nothing fancy, just solid metal that would serve as proof of their union. "Do you, Ethan Cole, take Clara Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Ethan said clearly, his eyes on Clara's face. "Do you, Clara Whitmore, take Ethan Cole to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Clara's voice shook slightly, but her words were firm. "I do. By the power vested in me by Dakota Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Cole, you may kiss your bride." Ethan hesitated, remembering Clara's fears, her boundaries, but she surprised him by leaning forward and pressing a quick, chaste kiss to his lips, a gesture of partnership, of thanks, of trust. It lasted barely a second, but it was enough. Thornton signed the marriage certificate with a flourish, then had Ethan and Clara sign, followed by Morrison and Wade as witnesses. The paper was official, legal, binding. In the eyes of the law, Clara was now Clara Cole, and Lucy was under Ethan's protection. The small gathering erupted in applause. Martha was crying, Morrison was smiling, and even Wade looked satisfied. Mrs. Henderson had arranged a small celebration back at the boarding house. Nothing elaborate, just cake and coffee, but it felt momentous anyway. As they walked back through town, Ethan carrying Lucy while Clara held his arm, people called out congratulations. News of the marriage would spread quickly through Elkhorn Ridge and beyond, which meant Marcus would hear about it soon. That thought sobered Ethan considerably. The wedding wasn't the end of their troubles. It was the beginning of a new phase. Marcus would be enraged when he learned Clara had married someone else. He'd fight harder, dig deeper, use every resource at his disposal to contest the marriage and reclaim what he considered his property. But let him try. Now Clara had legal protection, a new name, a husband who would stand between her and violence. Now Lucy had a father who would defend her with his life if necessary. The battle wasn't over, but they'd gained ground. At the boarding house, the small celebration was warm and genuine. People who'd come to care about Clara and Lucy, who'd watched her recovery, heard her story, believed her pain, offered their congratulations and support. Mrs. Henderson had rearranged rooms, giving the new family a larger space with room for Lucy's cradle and their few belongings. As evening fell and guests departed, Ethan and Clara found themselves alone in their new room for the first time as a married couple. The weight of that reality settled over them both. "I can sleep on the floor," Ethan offered immediately, "or in the chair. Whatever makes you comfortable." Clara looked at the single bed, then at him. "That's ridiculous. You're my husband now. We can share the bed like civilized people. I trust you to keep your word about boundaries." "Are you sure?" "No," Clara admitted. "But I need to start trusting again sometime. Might as well start with the man who's done nothing but keep his promises since the day he found me." They established a routine that would become familiar over the coming weeks. Ethan turning his back while Clara changed into her nightgown, Clara doing the same while he prepared for bed. They lay down with Lucy's cradle between them, a physical barrier that felt symbolic of so much else. "Ethan?" Clara's voice came through the darkness. "Yeah?" "Thank you. For today. For everything. For being the kind of man who makes promises and keeps them." "You're welcome," Ethan said simply. Silence fell, broken only by Lucy's soft breathing. Ethan stared at the ceiling, acutely aware of Clara's presence just feet away, equally aware of the distance between them that had nothing to do with physical space. They were married, bound by law and witnessed vows, but strangers in so many ways that mattered. Building a real partnership, the kind he'd promised her, would take time, patience, and work from both of them. But lying there in the darkness, listening to his wife and daughter breathe, Ethan felt something close to contentment. Not happiness, not yet, but something foundational and real. He'd made a choice in that prairie grass weeks ago. Today he doubled down on that choice, made it official and binding. There was no going back now, no way to unmake these decisions. His life was permanently altered, tied to two people who'd been strangers a month ago. And somehow, impossibly, that felt right. The peaceful moment shattered 2 days later when Marcus Whitmore returned to Elkhorn Ridge. Ethan was at the livery when he heard the commotion, angry voices from the direction of the boarding house. He dropped the harness he'd been mending and ran. A crowd had gathered outside Mrs. Henderson's establishment. Marcus stood on the porch, his face purple with rage, while Sheriff Wade blocked his path. Clara was visible in the doorway, pale but defiant, holding Lucy close. "My wife," Marcus was shouting. "She can't just marry someone else while legally bound to me. It's bigamy. It's fraud. It's legal," Wade said calmly. Judge Thornton performed the ceremony himself, signed and witnessed, all proper and official. "I don't care what some frontier judge says. Clara is my wife under Pennsylvania law. That marriage takes precedence over whatever sham she's concocted here." Ethan pushed through the crowd. "It's not a sham. We're legally married, and Clara chose this freely." Marcus whirled on him, and Ethan saw murder in the man's eyes. You did this. You stole my wife, corrupted her against me, turned her into a bigamist and a whore." Ethan's fist connected with Marcus's jaw before he'd consciously decided to throw the punch. The larger man stumbled backward, shock replacing rage on his face. The crowd gasped. "You watch your mouth when you talk about my wife," Ethan said, his voice deadly quiet. "You come near her again. You say one more word against her, and I'll do a lot more than bloody your lip." Wade stepped between them. "That's enough. Both of you stand down." Marcus wiped blood from his mouth, his eyes calculating now rather than simply enraged. "Assault," he said. "You all witnessed it. This man assaulted me without provocation." "You called his wife a whore," Mrs. Henderson called from the crowd. "That's provocation enough in any decent man's book." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the onlookers. Marcus was losing the crowd, and he seemed to realize it. He straightened his coat, trying to regain his composure and authority. "This isn't over," he said coldly. "I have lawyers, resources, connections. I'll take this to territorial court, to federal court, if necessary. Clara is my wife. The child is my daughter, and I will have what's mine, no matter how many frontier cowboys try to stop me." "Then we'll see you in court," Ethan said. "Bring your lawyers. We'll bring the truth." Marcus's smile was chilling. "The truth?" The truth is that you've kidnapped another man's wife and child. The truth is that you've perpetrated a fraud on the legal system. The truth is that when this is over, you'll be in jail and Clara will be back where she belongs, under my control." He turned to Clara, who stood frozen in the doorway. "Enjoy your little rebellion while it lasts, my dear. But know this, I never lose. Never. And when I win, you'll pay for every moment of defiance, you and your bastard cowboy both." With that, he strode to his carriage, leaving a wake of tension and fear behind him. The crowd slowly dispersed, uncomfortable with the ugly scene they'd witnessed. Wade remained, his expression grim. "He's right about one thing," the sheriff said quietly. "This will go to court, and when it does, you'll need more than moral righteousness on your side. You'll need evidence, testimony, legal expertise." "We'll get it," Ethan said with more confidence than he felt. That night, lying in their shared bed with Lucy sleeping peacefully between them, Clara finally broke down. Sobs shook her body, muffled against her pillow so as not to wake the baby. Ethan reached across Lucy's cradle, his hand finding Clara's in the darkness. "We'll fight him," he whispered. "We'll fight him and we'll win." "How?" Clara's voice was broken. "He has everything. Money, power, the law on his side. What do we have?" "We have the truth," Ethan said, "and we have each other. That has to be enough." Clara gripped his hand tightly, desperately. "I'm so scared, Ethan. I'm terrified he'll win, that everything you've sacrificed will be for nothing, that Lucy will grow up under his control." "That's not going to happen," Ethan said fiercely. "I swear to you, Clara, on everything I have, I won't let him take you or Lucy. I don't care what it costs, what I have to do. You're my wife now, Lucy's my daughter, and I protect what's mine." The possessive words might have terrified Clara once, coming from a man, but from Ethan, in the darkness of their shared room, they were different. They were safety, they were promise, they were choice made manifest. "Thank you," she whispered, "for fighting for us, for not giving up." "Never," Ethan promised. "I'll never give up on you." The battle lines were drawn. Marcus would return with lawyers and court orders, armed with legal precedent and social convention. But Ethan and Clara would stand together, backed by the truth of her suffering and the legitimacy of their new union. The war for Clara and Lucy's freedom was just beginning, and its outcome was far from certain. But lying there in the darkness, hands clasped across the divide between them, Ethan felt something he hadn't expected. Determination forged into purpose, purpose refined into love. Not romantic love yet, but something equally powerful. The love of a man for his chosen family, for the people he'd decided to protect regardless of cost. Marcus Whitmore thought he was fighting to reclaim his property. He had no idea he was fighting a man who'd found something worth dying for, and more importantly, worth living for. The real battle was about to begin. The weeks following Marcus's threat were tense, each day bringing the possibility that he might return with legal documents that could tear their fragile new family apart. Ethan threw himself into preparation, working with Morrison and Wade to gather every piece of evidence they could find. Martha documented her medical observations in meticulous detail. Mrs. Henderson wrote a statement about Clara's condition when she first arrived at the boarding house. Even the livery owner, who'd watched Ethan's dedication to his new family, offered to testify to his character. But the waiting gnawed at them all. Clara grew increasingly anxious, jumping at every sound of horses on the main street, her sleep disturbed by nightmares where Marcus dragged her and Lucy away while Ethan stood powerless to stop him. Lucy, sensitive to her mother's moods, became fussier, crying more often and sleeping less. Ethan found himself caught between maintaining their daily routine and preparing for the legal battle ahead. He'd taken a permanent position at the livery, providing steady income that would prove his ability to support a family. In the evenings, he studied law books Morrison borrowed from Judge Thornton, trying to understand the legal complexities they faced. "Dakota Territory law is murky on this," Morrison explained one night. The two men hunched over dusty legal texts in the doctor's office. "Marriage laws vary from state to state, and when you cross territorial lines, it gets complicated. Marcus's Pennsylvania marriage is valid, but so is your Dakota marriage. The question is which one takes precedence." "What do the books say?" Ethan asked. "They say it depends on the judge, the circumstances, and how good the lawyers are. Morrison closed the book with a sigh. The truth is, Ethan, this could go either way. You need to prepare yourself for the possibility that a court might rule in Marcus's favor. And if they do? Morrison met his eyes gravely. Then you'll have a choice to make. Accept the ruling and let Clara go, or defy it and become fugitives. The thought of running had crossed Ethan's mind more than once. They could disappear into the vast western territories, change their names, start over where Marcus could never find them. But that would mean living in constant fear, always looking over their shoulders, denying Lucy any chance at a normal life. There has to be another way, Ethan said. There might be. Morrison hesitated. Clara could testify about the abuse. If she's willing to stand in court and detail what Marcus did to her, it might sway a judge. Abuse is grounds for annulment in some jurisdictions. She'd have to relive all of it, Ethan said quietly, in front of strangers with Marcus watching. That's asking a lot. I know, but it might be the only way. When Ethan raised the possibility with Clara that night, her reaction was immediate and visceral. She went pale, her hands shaking as she clutched Lucy closer. I can't, she whispered. Ethan, I can't stand in a courtroom and talk about what he did while he sits there watching me. I can't give him that power over me again. You wouldn't be giving him power, Ethan said gently. You'd be taking it back, telling your truth where it matters, where it can make a legal difference. You don't understand, Claire's voice broke. The things he did, the ways he hurt me, I can barely think about them, let alone say them out loud. And if I do, if I stand there and detail every humiliation, every beating, and the court still rules in his favor, I'll have exposed my deepest wounds for nothing. Ethan moved to sit beside her on the bed, careful to maintain the respectful distance that had become their unspoken agreement. I understand you're scared, and I won't force you to do anything you're not ready for. But Clara, your testimony might be the difference between freedom and going back to that life, between Lucy growing up safe or growing up watching her father abuse her mother. Clara flinched at the brutal honesty, but she didn't look away. And if I testify and we lose anyway, then at least you'll have fought back. At least you'll have stood up and said, this is what he did to me and it was wrong. That matters, even if the outcome isn't what we want. She was quiet for a long time, rocking Lucy gently while tears ran silently down her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I'll think about it. It was all Ethan could ask for. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and wiped the tears from her cheek with his thumb. The gesture was gentle, almost brotherly, but Clara leaned into it slightly, a small sign of the trust building between them. The summons arrived on a gray October morning, delivered by a territorial marshal who rode into Elkhorn Ridge with official documents. Marcus had made good on his threat. The case would be heard in 3 weeks at the territorial courthouse in Rapid City, presided over by Judge Augustus Crane, a man known for his strict interpretation of law and his traditional views on marriage and family. This is bad, Wade said bluntly when they gathered to discuss the summons. Crane is old school, believes in the sanctity of the original marriage vow, believes wives belong with their legal husbands. If anyone was going to rule in Marcus's favor, it's him. Can we request a different judge? Ethan asked. Not this late. Marcus's lawyers made sure of that. Wade tossed the papers onto Morrison's desk in frustration. They've prepared their case carefully. They're not just arguing that Clara's marriage to Marcus takes precedence. They're arguing that her marriage to you is fraudulent, entered into specifically to evade her legal obligations to her first husband. That's not true, Clara protested. I married Ethan freely. But can you prove it wasn't primarily a legal strategy? Wade asked. Because that's what they'll argue. That you two barely knew each other, that the timing was suspicious, that it was all a calculated move to escape Marcus. It was a strategy, Ethan admitted, but it was also real. I wanted to marry Clara, wanted to protect her and Lucy. Both things can be true. Try explaining that to Judge Crane, Wade said darkly. The reality of their situation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. They had 3 weeks to build a case strong enough to convince a conservative judge that a month-old marriage between near strangers should take precedence over a years-old marriage sanctified in a Philadelphia church. The odds were not in their favor. "We need a lawyer," Morrison said, "someone who understands territorial law and can argue this effectively." "I know someone," Wade offered. "Samuel Brennan practices in Deadwood. He's young but sharp, and he's won cases everyone thought were hopeless. He's also got a reputation for taking on powerful men and not backing down." "Can we afford him?" Ethan asked. "Probably not," Wade said honestly. "But let me reach out. Brennan's got a thing about justice. He might take the case for less than his usual fee if he believes in it." 2 days later, Samuel Brennan arrived in Elkhorn Ridge. He was younger than Ethan expected, maybe 30, with sharp eyes and an intensity that suggested a mind constantly working through problems. He listened to their story without interruption, taking notes in a leather-bound journal, asking occasional pointed questions. When Clara faltered in describing Marcus's abuse, Brennan's expression softened. "Mrs. Cole, and I'm calling you that deliberately because that's your legal name now, I know this is difficult, but I need to understand everything Marcus did. Not for prurient interest, but because every detail helps me build our case." Clara took a shaky breath and continued, detailing years of violence with Morrison occasionally adding medical observations. By the end, Brennan's jaw was tight with anger. "This is worse than I expected," he said, "which is both good and bad for us. Good because the evidence of abuse is overwhelming. Bad because Marcus's lawyers will argue that you're exaggerating or lying to justify your actions." "She's not lying," Ethan said sharply. "I know she's not," Brennan replied. "But we have to anticipate their arguments. Marcus will present himself as the wronged husband, the victim of a wife's betrayal and a cowboy's interference. He'll paint Clara as unstable, possibly influenced by postpartum hysteria. He'll suggest that you, Mr. Cole, took advantage of a vulnerable woman for your own purposes." "That's not what happened," Clara protested. "I believe you, but belief and proof are different things in a courtroom." Brennan flipped through his notes. "Here's what we're up against. Marcus's marriage to you has legal precedent and social legitimacy. Your marriage to Mr. Cole looks suspiciously convenient timing-wise. Judge Crane will be inclined to favor the established order over what appears to be a disruption of it." "So we're going to lose," Clara said flatly. "Not necessarily." Brennan leaned forward. "We have advantages too. We have medical documentation of abuse. We have witnesses who saw your condition when you arrived. We have a legitimate marriage performed by a territorial judge. And we have the fact that you fled Marcus with an infant, which suggests genuine fear rather than simple marital discord." "Is that enough?" Ethan asked. "Maybe, if we present it right, if Clara's willing to testify, if we can demonstrate that her fear of Marcus is reasonable and justified." Brennan looked at Clara. "Which brings me to the hard question. Are you willing to take the stand and tell your story? Because without your testimony, our case is significantly weaker." Clara's hands were trembling. She looked at Lucy, sleeping peacefully in her cradle, unaware of the adult struggles surrounding her. Then she looked at Ethan, drawing strength from his steady presence. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "For Lucy. For the chance at a life where she doesn't grow up thinking violence is normal. I'll testify." Brennan nodded approvingly. "Good. Then here's how we'll proceed. We'll request a closed courtroom due to the sensitive nature of the testimony. Judge Crane might grant that, given it involves marital matters. We'll establish the timeline of events carefully, showing the progression of abuse and your multiple escape attempts. We'll present medical evidence that corroborates your account. And we'll demonstrate that your marriage to Mr. Cole, while unconventional in its timing, was entered into freely and with genuine intent to build a life together." "What about Marcus's lawyers?" Morrison asked. "What will they argue?" "They'll argue that Clara exaggerates or fabricates the abuse. They'll present Marcus as a respectable businessman wronged by a disobedient wife. They'll question the legitimacy of your marriage, Mr. Cole, suggesting it's a sham designed to circumvent legal obligations. And they'll probably argue that Clara is an unfit mother who abandoned her child in the wilderness. Yes, I know she didn't abandon Lucy. She was trying to save her, but they'll twist the facts." The enormity of what they faced was staggering. Ethan felt the weight of it pressing down on his shoulders, the responsibility for Clara and Lucy's future. the knowledge that his impulsive decision to marry Clara might not be enough to protect them after all. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan sat in the boarding house parlor long after Clara and Lucy had gone to bed. He was staring into the dying fire when Clara appeared in her nightgown, Lucy in her arms. "She wouldn't settle," Clara explained quietly. "I think she senses something's wrong." Ethan stood and took the baby, cradling her against his chest with the practiced ease he'd developed over the past weeks. Lucy immediately calmed, her tiny hand gripping his shirt, her eyes already drooping. "You're good with her," Clara observed, sitting beside him. "She's easy to be good with," Ethan replied. "Not like legal battles and territorial judges." Clara was quiet for a moment, watching Lucy fall asleep in Ethan's arms. "I'm sorry I got you into this. You should be somewhere free right now, not tied to a woman with more problems than prospects." "Stop apologizing for existing," Ethan said firmly. "I made my choice. I'd make it again." "Even knowing how complicated it would become?" "Especially knowing that." He looked at her seriously. "Clara, the day I found you and Lucy in that grass, I stopped being the man I was before. I can't go back to drifting, to living only for myself. You and Lucy changed me. That's not something to apologize for." "But if we lose, we'll figure something out," Ethan interrupted. "Running, hiding, I don't know, but I'm not letting Marcus take you back. That's not going to happen." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You'd become a fugitive for us? Risk everything you've built here?" "I'd risk a lot more than that," Ethan said simply. She reached out and touched his face gently, a gesture she'd never made before. "I wish I could give you what you deserve. A real wife, a real marriage, not this complicated mess where I can barely stand to be touched." "You give me plenty," Ethan said, catching her hand and holding it gently. "You give me purpose. You give me Lucy's smiles and your trust and the chance to be something more than just another cowboy. That's more than I ever expected from life." "But it's not enough," Clara whispered. "Not for a whole lifetime." "Let me decide what's enough for me," Ethan said. "You focus on getting ready for the trial. Focus on being strong enough to stand up there and tell your truth. The rest, what this marriage is or isn't, we'll figure that out after we've won." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of trust and exhaustion. They sat like that for a long time, Lucy sleeping between them, the fire burning low, both of them trying not to think about what failure would mean. The 3 weeks before the trial passed in a blur of preparation. Brennan drilled Clara on her testimony, teaching her how to answer questions clearly and calmly, how to resist the emotional manipulation Marcus's lawyers would surely attempt. He worked with Ethan on his own testimony, establishing the timeline of events and his motivations. Morrison compiled medical records into an organized file that would be devastating in its clinical documentation of abuse. But despite all the preparation, as the day of the trial approached, tension mounted. Clara's nightmares worsened. Ethan found himself increasingly short-tempered, snapping at minor problems at the livery. Even Lucy seemed affected, crying more than usual and clinging to both her parents with desperate intensity. The night before they were to leave for Rapid City, Ethan found Clara packing their few belongings with shaking hands. Tears streamed down her face as she folded Lucy's tiny clothes. "I can't do this," she said when she noticed him watching. "I can't stand in that courtroom and face him and relive everything and risk losing anyway. I can't, Ethan." He crossed the room and took the baby clothes from her hands, setting them aside. Then, breaking their unspoken rule about physical contact, he pulled her into his arms. She stiffened initially, but then collapsed against him, sobbing into his chest while he held her and murmured reassurances he wasn't sure he believed. "You're the strongest person I know," he said quietly. "You survived years with Marcus. You escaped with a newborn baby. You walked through the wilderness refusing to give up. You can do this too." "What if it's not enough? What if we lose and he takes us and this is the last night we're ever free?" "Then we'll have this night," Ethan said. "We'll have tonight, and the memory of what we tried to build. Marcus can take your future, but he can't take the fact that you fought back, that you chose your own path for as long as you could." Clara pulled back to look at him, her eyes red from crying. "Hold me," she whispered. "Not like a husband holds a wife, just like a friend holds someone who's scared. Please." Ethan led her to the bed and lay down, fully clothed, pulling her against his side with one arm while she curled into his warmth. It was the closest they'd been since their marriage. The most vulnerable Clara had allowed herself to be. He could feel her heartbeat racing, feel the tremors that ran through her body, and he held her carefully, like something precious and breakable. "I've got you," he murmured. "Whatever happens tomorrow, tonight, I've got you." She cried herself to sleep in his arms, and Ethan lay awake listening to her breathing, gradually slow and steady. Lucy slept in her cradle nearby, innocent and trusting. 2 lives depending on him to be strong enough, smart enough, determined enough to protect them from a man who had law and money and tradition on his side. The odds were terrible. The chances of winning seemed slim, but lying there in the darkness with his wife asleep against him and his daughter breathing softly nearby, Ethan felt something crystallize inside him, a determination so fierce it bordered on rage. Marcus Whitmore wanted a fight? He'd get one. And whatever the outcome, Ethan would make damn sure Marcus knew he'd been in a battle. They left for Rapid City at dawn, taking Morrison's wagon since Clara and Lucy couldn't manage the journey on horseback. Brennan rode alongside them, still reviewing notes and strategy. The 2-day trip was tense and quiet, everyone lost in their own thoughts about what was coming. Rapid City was larger than Elkhorn Ridge, a booming town swollen with miners, merchants, and settlers drawn by the promise of gold and opportunity. The territorial courthouse was an imposing stone building in the center of town, its columns and formal architecture a stark reminder that this was where law and order supposedly prevailed. Marcus was already there, Ethan saw immediately. His expensive carriage stood outside a hotel across from the courthouse, and through the hotel window, Ethan could see him conferring with 2 well-dressed men who could only be his lawyers. Marcus looked up at that moment, and their eyes met across the street. The hatred in Marcus's gaze was palpable, promising that whatever happened in that courtroom, this was far from over. Brennan had secured them rooms in a more modest establishment near the courthouse. That evening, he ran through final preparations with Clara one last time. "They're going to try to shake you," he warned. "They'll imply you're lying, exaggerating, mentally unstable. When they do, I need you to stay calm, stick to the facts, and remember why you're doing this." "For Lucy," Clara said quietly, looking at her daughter sleeping peacefully after the long journey. "For Lucy," Brennan agreed. "And for yourself. You deserve freedom, Clara. You deserve a life without fear. Remember that when it gets hard tomorrow." The trial began at 9 the next morning in a wood-paneled courtroom that smelled of old books and furniture polish. Judge Augustus Crane presided from his elevated bench, his stern face and ramrod posture suggesting a man who valued order above all else. The courtroom was packed, despite Brennan's request for a closed hearing. Crane had denied that motion, stating that justice must be public. Marcus sat with his lawyers at one table, looking every inch the respectable gentleman wronged by circumstance. Clara sat with Brennan and Ethan at the other, her face pale but composed. Lucy was with Martha Morrison, who'd accompanied them to Rapid City to watch the baby during the proceedings. The prosecution, because that's effectively what Marcus's lawyers were, opened with a clear narrative. Marcus Whitmore was a respected businessman whose wife had suffered from mental instability following childbirth. In her confused state, she'd fled with their infant daughter, ultimately being found by a cowboy who'd taken advantage of her vulnerable condition. This cowboy, seeing an opportunity, had convinced Clara to enter into a fraudulent marriage designed to circumvent her legal obligations to her true husband. The marriage to Ethan Cole was invalid because Clara was already married and she should be returned to her husband's care along with their daughter. It was a compelling narrative delivered smoothly by a lawyer who clearly knew how to work a courtroom. When he finished, Ethan could see doubt on some faces in the gallery. Even Judge Crane looked sympathetic to Marcus's plight. Then it was Brennan's turn. He rose slowly, his opening statement quieter, but no less powerful. "Your Honor," he began, "the prosecution has told you a story about a confused woman and an opportunistic cowboy. But that's not what happened. What happened is that a desperate woman, fleeing years of brutal abuse, was abandoned in the wilderness by the very man who now claims to be worried about her welfare. What happened is that a decent man heard a baby crying and couldn't ride past. What happened is that when this woman was given a real choice, perhaps the first real choice she'd had in years, She chose freedom over captivity, safety over violence, a future over a past that had nearly killed her. He paused, letting his words settle. Over the next few days, you'll hear testimony about what Marcus Whitmore did to his wife during their marriage. You'll see medical evidence of injuries that tell a story of systematic abuse. You'll hear from witnesses who saw Clara Cole's condition when she first arrived in Elkhorn Ridge. And you'll have to decide which narrative makes more sense. A confused woman who wandered off and was taken advantage of, or a brave woman who finally found the courage to escape and was given help by someone who asked for nothing in return. The battle was joined. Over the next 2 days, witnesses testified, evidence was presented, and the truth of Clara's suffering was laid bare for the courtroom to see. Morrison testified about her injuries, describing them with clinical precision that was damning in its detail. Martha described finding Clara unconscious and fevered, the baby starving and dehydrated. Sheriff Wade testified about Marcus's threatening behavior when he'd come to Elkhorn Ridge. But Marcus's lawyers fought back hard. They produced character witnesses who swore Marcus was a kind husband, that they'd never seen him raise a hand to Clara. They suggested that her injuries could have been sustained during her flight through the wilderness rather than at Marcus's hands. They painted a picture of a woman prone to hysteria and exaggeration, someone not in her right mind after giving birth. Through it all, Clara sat silent and rigid, her hands clenched in her lap as her life was dissected and debated. Ethan wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort, but Brennan had advised against any displays of affection in court. It might look staged, calculated. Finally, on the third day, Clara was called to testify. As she walked to the witness stand, Ethan saw her hands trembling, saw the terror in her eyes. But she raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth, her voice clear despite her fear. Brennan led her through the story gently, establishing the timeline of her marriage to Marcus, the escalating abuse, her escape attempts. Clara spoke in a steady voice, describing horrors in clinical detail, the broken ribs, the black eyes, the times Marcus had choked her until she passed out. The courtroom was utterly silent, every person riveted by her testimony. Then came the cross-examination, and Marcus's lead lawyer showed no mercy. He paced in front of Clara like a predator, his questions designed to undermine and humiliate. "Mrs. Whitmore, and that is your legal name, isn't it? You claim my client abused you for years, yet you never reported this abuse to authorities, did you?" "No," Clara admitted. "Why not? Surely if the abuse was as severe as you claim—" "Because I was afraid," Clara said. "Afraid he'd kill me if I tried, and because I knew no one would believe me. Marcus was respected, wealthy. I was just his wife." "Or perhaps there was no abuse to report," the lawyer suggested. "Perhaps these injuries you claim were caused by something else entirely. Falls, accidents, your own clumsiness." "No," Clara said firmly. "Marcus hit me, repeatedly, for years. And yet you stayed with him. You continued to live as his wife, to share his bed, to bear his child. Doesn't that suggest the situation wasn't as terrible as you now claim?" Clara's face flushed with anger and shame. "I stayed because I had no choice. I stayed because leaving meant risking my life. I stayed until I couldn't anymore, until I had a daughter who I refused to let grow up watching what I endured." The lawyer switched tactics. "Tell me about Ethan Cole. How long had you known him when you married him?" "Less than a month," Clara admitted. "Less than a month," the lawyer repeated. "And yet you claim this marriage is legitimate, entered into freely and with genuine intent." "Yes." "Isn't it true that you married Mr. Cole specifically to avoid returning to my client? That it was a calculated legal strategy rather than a genuine marriage?" Clara hesitated, and Ethan saw the trap closing. If she admitted the marriage was partly strategic, it undermined their case. If she denied it, she'd be lying under oath. "It was both," Clara said finally, her voice strong. "Yes, I needed protection from Marcus. Yes, marrying Ethan gave me legal standing I didn't have before. But I also married him because he showed me kindness when I'd forgotten what that felt like. Because he gave me choices instead of taking them away. Because he's been more of a husband in 1 month than Marcus was in 3 years. So yes, it was strategy, but it was also real." The answer seemed to catch the lawyer off guard. He fumbled briefly before recovering. "You claim Mr. Cole has been a good husband. Yet isn't it true that you barely know him? That this entire marriage is built on desperation rather than any genuine foundation? Before Clara could answer, the courtroom door burst open. A deputy marshal strode in, heading directly for Judge Crane's bench. He handed the judge a document, spoke quietly for a moment, then stepped back. Crane's expression darkened as he read. When he looked up, his eyes went straight to Marcus. "Mr. Whitmore, would you approach the bench, please? Your lawyers as well." Marcus stood, confusion evident on his face. There was a hurried conference at the bench, too quiet for the rest of the courtroom to hear. But Ethan watched Marcus's face go from confusion to shock to rage. Whatever was in that document, it wasn't good for him. Crane's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "We'll take a 30-minute recess while I review this new information. Everyone is to remain available. This trial is not concluded." As the courtroom emptied for the break, Brennan cornered the deputy marshal. "What was in that document?" he demanded. The marshal glanced at the judge, received a subtle nod, and answered. "Seems Mr. Whitmore has some outstanding warrants in Pennsylvania. Allegations of fraud related to his railroad investments. Someone, and I'm not at liberty to say who, sent evidence to the territorial authorities suggesting he might be in Dakota to avoid prosecution back east." Ethan felt a surge of hope. "Does that change anything for our case?" "Depends on what the judge decides," Brennan said carefully. "But it certainly doesn't help Marcus's portrayal of himself as a respectable citizen wronged by his wife." When court reconvened, Judge Crane looked even more stern than usual. He addressed the courtroom without preamble. "I've reviewed the information provided by territorial authorities regarding Mr. Marcus Whitmore. While these criminal allegations are separate from the matter before this court, they do speak to the question of character and credibility. Mr. Whitmore, you are hereby ordered to remain in Rapid City pending investigation of fraud charges. You will surrender your passport to the marshal." Marcus surged to his feet. "This is outrageous. I'm the victim here, and you're treating me like a criminal." "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore," Crane said coldly, "or I'll hold you in contempt." Marcus sat, his face purple with fury. His lawyers were whispering urgently, clearly blindsided by this development. Crane continued. "Now, as to the matter of the competing marriage claims, I've listened to 3 days of testimony. I've reviewed medical evidence that, frankly, is deeply disturbing. I've watched Mrs. Cole, and I use that name deliberately, testify with a credibility I found compelling. And I've observed Mr. Whitmore's behavior both in this courtroom and according to witness statements." He paused, his expression unreadable. "The law in these cases is complex and open to interpretation. A strict reading would suggest that the first marriage takes precedence. However, the law also recognizes certain circumstances under which a marriage can be annulled or set aside, including cases of extreme cruelty." Ethan's heart was pounding. Was Crane actually going to rule in their favor? "After careful consideration," Crane said, "I find that Clara Cole has provided sufficient evidence of abuse to justify her flight from her marriage to Marcus Whitmore. Furthermore, I find that her subsequent marriage to Ethan Cole, while unconventional in its timing and circumstances, was entered into freely and with legitimate intent. Therefore, I am ruling that the marriage between Clara Cole and Ethan Cole is valid and legally binding." The courtroom erupted. Clara gasped, tears streaming down her face. Ethan gripped her hand, barely believing what he'd heard. Marcus was shouting, his lawyers trying to calm him while arguing vehemently with the judge. Crane's gavel slammed down repeatedly. "Order, I'm not finished." When the room quieted, he continued, "As for the child, Lucy Cole, I am granting full parental rights to Ethan Cole, who has served as her father since her rescue. Marcus Whitmore's parental rights are hereby suspended pending resolution of the criminal charges against him. Should he be acquitted of those charges, he may petition to revisit custody at that time, but such petition will be viewed in light of the evidence of abuse presented in this trial." More chaos. More gaveling, but through it all, Ethan heard only Clara's voice, breaking with emotion as she repeated one word over and over. "Free. We're free." The next moments were a blur. Brennan was shaking Ethan's hand, Morrison was embracing Clara, Martha was crying with relief. Across the courtroom, Marcus was being restrained by deputies as he screamed threats and accusations that no one was listening to anymore. But the victory felt fragile, incomplete. Marcus was still there, still dangerous, still furious. As they filed out of the courtroom, Ethan kept Clara close, his eyes scanning for threats, his body tense with the knowledge that a desperate man was capable of anything. The threat materialized that night. Ethan had just finished checking on Lucy, who was sleeping peacefully in Martha's hotel room, when he returned to find their own room's door ajar. He'd locked it. He knew he'd locked it. Drawing his gun, he pushed the door open slowly. The room appeared empty, but something felt wrong. Then he saw it. A note on the pillow, written in an elegant hand that could only be Marcus's. "This isn't over. You've won a battle, but the war continues. Watch your back, cowboy. Watch your wife. Watch your bastard daughter. Accidents happen on the frontier. People disappear. And when they do, no judge's ruling will matter." Ethan crumpled the note, rage flooding through him. Marcus might have lost in court, but he was making it clear he hadn't accepted defeat. The legal threat was over, but a more dangerous personal threat had just begun. He found Clara in Martha's room, holding Lucy and talking quietly with the doctor's wife. One look at his face told her something was wrong. "What happened?" Ethan showed her the note. Her face went white. "He was in our room. He was that close." "We're leaving," Ethan said decisively. "Tonight. We're not staying in Rapid City another hour with Marcus free and making threats." "But the marshal said he has to stay." "That doesn't mean we have to," Ethan interrupted. "We won, Clara. We're legally married. Lucy is legally ours. There's nothing keeping us here, and every reason to get as far from Marcus as possible before he does something desperate." Within an hour, they'd packed and settled accounts. Morrison insisted on accompanying them back to Elkhorn Ridge, adding his wagon and presents to their party. Brennan wanted to come too, but Ethan convinced him to stay and monitor Marcus's situation, to alert them if the man somehow got free or if new threats emerged. They traveled through the night, pushing hard, everyone too nervous to stop for more than brief rests. Every sound in the darkness made Ethan reach for his rifle. Every shadow could be Marcus or men he'd hired. The paranoia was exhausting, but the alternative, letting their guard down, could be fatal. Dawn found them halfway to Elkhorn Ridge, exhausted but still moving. Lucy was fussy from the disrupted routine, and Clara looked haggard, dark circles under her eyes. But they were together, they were free, and they were putting distance between themselves and the man who'd terrorized Clara for so long. "Do you think he'll come after us?" Clara asked quietly, as the sun rose over the prairie. "Yes," Ethan said honestly. "Eventually. When he thinks we've relaxed, when he thinks we feel safe, that's when he'll make his move." "So we'll never be truly safe," Clara said. "We'll always be looking over our shoulders." Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face her directly. "We have two choices," he said. "We can live in fear, always waiting for Marcus to strike. Or we can build a life so strong, so rooted, that even if he comes, he can't shake it. We can build a home, a family, a future that's ours, not his, not the court's, ours. And if he comes after that, we'll be ready." Clara looked at him for a long moment, then at Lucy sleeping in her arms, then back at Ethan. Something shifted in her expression, fear receding, determination taking its place. "Then let's build something worth defending," she said. As they started moving again, heading toward Elkhorn Ridge and whatever future waited there, Ethan felt the weight of Marcus's threat, the shadow of violence that still hung over them. The legal battle was won, but the real test was just beginning. The test of building a life together, of transforming a marriage of convenience into something real, of proving that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one that tries to destroy you. The war wasn't over, but they'd won the first major battle, and that was something. It had to be enough to build on, because it was all they had. The weeks following their return to Elkhorn Ridge were tense with waiting. Ethan kept his rifle close, slept lightly, and made sure someone always knew where Clara and Lucy were. Sheriff Wade posted notices at the town's edges, warning of a potentially dangerous man, and the community, having heard about the trial's outcome, rallied around the small family with a protectiveness that surprised even Ethan. But Marcus didn't come. Days stretched into weeks, and weeks into a month, and still there was no sign of him. Brennan sent word from Rapid City that Marcus had been formally charged with fraud and was awaiting trial, though he'd made bail and was supposedly still in the area. The lack of action was almost worse than an attack would have been. keeping them in a constant state of anxious anticipation. Clara struggled with the aftermath of the trial. Having finally spoken her truth publicly, having stood up to Marcus in court, she'd expected to feel liberated. Instead, she found herself plagued by nightmares and sudden waves of fear that left her shaking. She'd flinch at unexpected sounds, panic if Ethan was late returning from work, and spend hours watching Lucy sleep as if to reassure herself the baby was still there. "It's normal," Morrison told Ethan one evening when he confided his concerns. "She spent years living in fear, and that doesn't just disappear because a judge ruled in her favor. Her body and mind need time to understand they're actually safe now." "How do I help her?" Ethan asked. "Be patient. Be consistent. Keep your promises, even small ones. Let her learn through experience that you're not Marcus, that this life is different." So Ethan tried. He established predictable routines, coming home at the same time each evening, always telling Clara where he was going and when he'd return. He gave her space when she needed it and presence when she sought it. He took on more care of Lucy, giving Clara time to simply rest and heal. And gradually, slowly, he began to see small changes. Clara started sleeping through the night more often. Her hands didn't shake as much. She smiled more readily, especially when playing with Lucy. And one evening, about 6 weeks after the trial, she did something that marked a turning point. She reached for Ethan's hand voluntarily, not out of fear or need for comfort, but simply because she wanted the connection. They were sitting on the porch of the small house Ethan had managed to rent, a modest 2-room structure on the edge of town that was a step up from the boarding house and felt more like a real home. Lucy was asleep inside, and the autumn evening was cool and peaceful. "I've been thinking," Clara said quietly, her hand warm in Ethan's, "about what you said in the wagon, about building something worth defending." "Yeah? I want to start teaching. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that several families have been asking about education for their children. I thought I could start small, maybe just a few students in our front room. It wouldn't be much money at first, but—" "I think it's a great idea," Ethan interrupted. "You'd be an excellent teacher." Clara smiled, and it reached her eyes in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten. "You haven't even heard my full plan yet." "Don't need to. If you want to teach, you should teach. Whatever you need to make it happen, we'll figure it out." "Just like that?" Clara asked. "No discussion, no conditions?" "Just like that. It's your decision, Clara, your life. I told you we'd be partners, and partners support each other's dreams." She was quiet for a moment, her thumb absently tracing patterns on the back of his hand. Marcus would have forbidden it, would have said it was unseemly for his wife to work, that it reflected poorly on his ability to provide. "Oh, a good thing Marcus's opinions don't matter anymore," Ethan said firmly. "No," Clara agreed softly. "They don't, do they?" She said it like she was testing the words, learning to believe them. The teaching endeavor began modestly. 3 students, children of local families, who met in the front room 3 mornings a week. Clara threw herself into the work with an enthusiasm that was beautiful to watch. She created lessons, gathered whatever books she could find or borrow, and approached each child's education with the dedication she'd once dreamed of giving. Ethan would come home to find her surrounded by slates and primers, Lucy playing contentedly nearby, Clara's face lit with purpose. Those moments convinced him more than any words could that they'd made the right choice, that the risks they'd taken had been worth it. But the shadow of Marcus still lingered, and Ethan couldn't fully relax. He kept his vigilance, maintained his routines of checking locks and watching for strangers. And his caution proved warranted when, 2 months after the trial, Brennan sent an urgent telegram. "Marcus acquitted on technicality. Left Rapid City 3 days ago. Destination unknown. Be cautious." Ethan's blood ran cold. He found Wade immediately, showed him the telegram, and together they prepared for what felt inevitable. The sheriff organized a watch rotation, with trusted men keeping eyes on the roads into town. Ethan moved Clara and Lucy to Morrison's house temporarily. The doctor's place was more defensible and had more people around. "He's coming," Clara said flatly when Ethan explained the situation. There was fear in her eyes, but also a steely determination that hadn't been there before. "This is it, isn't it? The confrontation we've been dreading." "Maybe," Ethan admitted, "or maybe he's headed somewhere else entirely. But I'm not taking chances with you and Lucy." 3 more days passed with no sign of Marcus. The tension in Elkhorn Ridge was palpable, everyone on edge, waiting for violence that seemed inevitable but refused to arrive. Then, on the fourth night, everything came to a head. Ethan was making a final check of the Morrison property before trying to sleep when he heard horses approaching fast. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, his heart pounding. In the moonlight, he could see riders, 3 of them, moving purposefully toward the house. "Wade!" he called out. The sheriff had been sleeping in Morrison's parlor for exactly this reason. "We've got company." The household erupted into controlled chaos. Wade grabbed his shotgun, Morrison armed himself with an old army revolver, and Martha hustled Clara and Lucy into the back room where they'd prepared a hiding space behind a heavy wardrobe. The riders pulled up outside, and Ethan's worst fears were confirmed. Marcus sat on the lead horse, flanked by 2 rough-looking men who were clearly hired muscle rather than lawyers or lawmen. In the moonlight, Marcus looked haggard and wild, nothing like the polished businessman who'd appeared in court. "Ethan Cole," Marcus shouted, "I know you're in there. Send out my wife and daughter, or we're coming in." Wade moved to the door, his badge visible in the lamplight. "Marcus Whitmore, you're trespassing and making threats. Turn around and leave, or I'll arrest you for disturbing the peace." "Arrest me?" Marcus laughed, and the sound was unhinged. "You think I care about your frontier justice? You think your little court ruling means anything? Clara is my wife. The child is mine, and I'm taking them back tonight." "Over my dead body," Ethan called out, positioning himself where he had a clear shot if needed. "That can be arranged," one of Marcus's hired men growled, his hand moving to his gun. "Everyone calm down," Wade said firmly. "Nobody needs to die here tonight. Mr. Whitmore, you lost your case in court. You lost your parental rights. This isn't legal, and you know it." "I don't care about legal," Marcus roared. "I care about what's mine. 3 years I invested in that woman, tolerating her weakness, her defiance. I gave her everything, and she repays me by running off with some cowboy? By making me look like a fool? No, that ends tonight." Ethan felt cold certainty settle over him. Marcus had gone past reason, past law, into pure obsession and rage. There would be no talking him down, no peaceful resolution. This was ending one way or another. "Clara isn't yours," Ethan called out. "She never was. She's a person, not property. And she chose to leave you because you're a violent bastard who doesn't understand the difference between a wife and a possession." Marcus dismounted, his face twisted with fury. This is all your fault. If you'd just ridden past them that day, if you'd minded your own business, everything would be fine. But you had to play hero. You had to steal what was mine." "I didn't steal anything," Ethan said. "I offered help to someone who needed it. The rest was Clara's choice." "She doesn't get to choose," Marcus screamed, and in that moment Ethan saw the complete break from sanity. This man would never accept defeat, would never acknowledge Clara's autonomy. He would rather destroy everything than admit he'd lost. Marcus reached for his gun, and several things happened simultaneously. Wade shouted a warning, Ethan's rifle came up, and the 2 hired men drew their weapons. For a frozen second, everyone was armed and aimed and one trigger pull away from bloodshed. Then Clara stepped out onto the porch, Lucy in her arms. "Clara, no!" Ethan shouted, trying to move in front of her, but she sidestepped him with surprising speed. "Stop!" she called out, her voice cutting through the tension. "Marcus, stop this madness right now!" Marcus stared at her, his gun half raised, shock and hunger warring on his face. "Clara, you're here. You're actually here." "Of course I'm here," Clara said, and her voice was steady despite the trembling Ethan could see in her hands. "This is my home. These are my people, and you need to leave." "Your home?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "Your home is with me, in Philadelphia, where you belong. This frontier hovel, this pretend life with this cowboy, it's not real, Clara. It's some fantasy you've concocted in your damaged mind." "No," Clara said firmly. "My life with you was the fantasy. The fantasy that if I was obedient enough, quiet enough, perfect enough, you'd stop hurting me. The fantasy that you'd ever see me as anything more than property. This," she gestured to the house, to Ethan, to the community standing ready to defend her. "This is real. This is people who care about me as a person, not as an object they own." "I gave you everything," Marcus shouted. "You gave me nothing but pain and fear," Clara countered. "You beat me, Marcus. You terrorized me. You made me afraid to speak, to breathe, to exist. And when I finally found the courage to escape, you abandoned me in the wilderness to die. You left your own daughter to starve. What kind of man does that? You drove me to it, Marcus's voice cracked. Your defiance, your disrespect, you made me act that way. No, Clara said, and there was steel in her voice now. I didn't make you do anything. You chose violence. You chose cruelty. You chose to be a monster, and then you blamed me for your choices, but I'm done accepting that blame. I'm done letting you make me responsible for your actions. She stepped forward, still holding Lucy, and Ethan moved with her, his rifle ready. You want to know why I chose Ethan over you? It's not because he's rich. He's not. It's not because he promised me luxury. He didn't. It's because when I was at my lowest, when I was literally dying in the grass, he stopped. He helped. He asked nothing in return. And every day since, he's shown me what a real man looks like. Someone who keeps his promises, who respects my choices, who treats me like a partner instead of property. Marcus's face was purple with rage. You self-righteous. You think you're better than me now? You think this changes anything? It changes everything, Clara said, because I'm not afraid of you anymore, Marcus. You can threaten, you can rage, you can even shoot me right here on this porch, but you can't make me yours again. That power died the day I walked into that wilderness. You killed it with your own hands. For a long moment, Marcus just stared at her, his gun wavering. Ethan could see the war playing out on his face. Rage versus reason, obsession versus reality. The hired men were looking nervous now, clearly not having signed up for whatever this had become. Then Marcus did something unexpected. He lowered his gun and laughed, a broken, bitter sound. You know what the funny thing is? I actually loved you. In my way, with my limitations, I loved you. And you threw it all away for this. If that was love, Clara said quietly, then I'm glad to be without it. Something in Marcus seemed to shatter. His shoulders slumped. His face aged a decade in seconds. So that's it then. You've made your choice. I made my choice months ago, Clara said. I'm just finally strong enough to say it to your face. Leave, Marcus. Go back east. Find some other woman to terrorize, but leave us alone. Because if you don't, if you keep coming after us, I'll testify again. I'll tell every court, every newspaper, every person who'll listen exactly what you are. I'll destroy your reputation the way you tried to destroy my spirit. Marcus flinched as if struck. For the first time, Ethan saw something like fear in the man's eyes. Not fear of violence, but fear of exposure, of social destruction. Marcus's whole identity was built on his image as a respectable businessman. The threat of having that image demolished was perhaps the only thing that could truly hurt him. You wouldn't, Marcus said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Try me, Clara said flatly. I've already lost everything I was afraid to lose. You have no power over me anymore. But you still have a reputation, business connections, a social position. Keep pushing, and I'll take all of that away from you. The standoff continued for another few heartbeats. Then one of the hired men cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore, I didn't sign on for this. You said it was a simple custody matter, not threatening armed men and terrorizing women. I'm out. He holstered his gun and turned his horse, riding off into the darkness. The second hired man hesitated only a moment before following. And suddenly Marcus was alone, facing a porch full of armed, determined people. His hired muscle gone. His last card played. This isn't over, he said, but the words lacked conviction. Yes, Clara said quietly, it is. Goodbye, Marcus. For a long moment, Marcus just sat there on his horse, a broken man watching his last hope slip away. Then, without another word, he turned his horse and rode slowly into the darkness. Not fleeing, not charging, just leaving, defeated in a way the court ruling had never quite accomplished. Ethan kept his rifle up until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Wade was already organizing men to make sure Marcus actually left town and didn't circle back. Morrison was checking Clara for any sign of collapse after her incredible display of courage. But Clara stood steady, Lucy calm in her arms, her face reflecting something Ethan hadn't seen there before. Peace. You were incredible, Ethan said softly when the chaos had calmed and they were finally alone in Morrison's parlor. Standing up to him like that, saying everything you needed to say. I was terrified, but you were fearless. I wasn't fearless, Clara corrected. I was terrified. But I realized something standing there looking at him. He was just a man, not a monster, not some all-powerful force, just a broken, angry man who'd built his whole identity on controlling me. And the moment I stopped giving him that power, he had nothing. "Do you think he'll come back?" Ethan asked. Clara considered the question seriously. "Maybe someday, if his obsession takes hold again. But not like this. I saw something break in him tonight. He realized he'd lost, truly lost. And men like Marcus need to win. Facing the fact that he can't have me, that I chose someone else and am happy, that's a wound to his ego that will hurt far more than any court ruling." She shifted Lucy to her other arm, the baby sleeping peacefully through the entire dramatic evening. "And if he does come back, we'll face him together. As partners. As family. And we'll win again." The word family hung in the air between them, weighted with new meaning. Ethan reached out and gently touched Lucy's tiny hand, and the baby's fingers curled around his reflexively, even in sleep. "Is that what we are now?" he asked quietly. "A real family?" Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and Ethan saw something shift in her eyes. "We've been a family for a while now, I think. I was just too scared to admit it." "And now?" "Now I'm still scared," Clara admitted. "But I'm also happy. And I think maybe I'm ready to try to build something real with you. Not just a legal arrangement or a strategic partnership, but something more." Ethan's heart was pounding. What does that mean? Clara set Lucy carefully in her cradle, then turned back to Ethan. She took both his hands in hers, a gesture she'd never initiated before. "It means I want to try to be a real wife to you, if you'll have me. Not right away. I'm still healing, still learning to trust. But someday, if you're willing to be patient." "I've got nothing but patience," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "I told you from the start, Clara. We do this at your pace. That hasn't changed." "I know," Clara said softly. "And that's why I think I can do this. Because you've never demanded, never pressured. You've just been steady and kind and everything Marcus never was." She paused, gathering courage. "I don't know if I can ever love the way normal people do. Marcus damaged something in me, and I don't know if it can be fully repaired." "Then we'll figure out our own kind of love," Ethan said simply. "One built on trust and partnership and choosing each other every day. That's enough for me if it's enough for you." Tears were streaming down Clara's face, but she was smiling. "It's more than enough. It's everything I never dared to hope for." They stood there in Morrison's lamplight parlor, hands clasped, and Ethan felt something slot into place in his chest. This was what he'd been looking for all those years of drifting, not freedom from connection, but connection worth committing to. A purpose beyond himself, a future worth building. "So what happens now?" Clara asked. "Marcus is gone, the legal battles are won, we have our freedom. What do we do with it?" Ethan thought about the question. "We build that life you talked about. We expand your teaching, maybe get a real schoolhouse going. We save up and buy some land, build a proper house. We raise Lucy to be strong and free and nothing like her biological father. We build something that's ours." "That sounds perfect," Claire said. "Ordinary and perfect and nothing like the life I thought I'd have." "Ordinary is underrated," Ethan said with a slight smile. "I'll take ordinary and safe over dramatic and dangerous any day." They returned to their small rented house the next morning, and life in Elkhorn Ridge slowly returned to normal. Wade confirmed that Marcus had left town, and according to sources, had returned east. Brennan sent word that Marcus was focusing on rebuilding his business reputation, and seemed to have finally accepted that Clara was lost to him. The months that followed were transformative. Clara's teaching expanded to 8 students, then 12. The front room of their house became a proper classroom, and talk began about raising funds for a real school building. Clara bloomed in the work, her confidence growing as she discovered she had real talent for teaching and that the community valued her contribution. Ethan continued working at the livery, but he also began buying small parcels of land on the edge of town with an eye toward eventual ranching. It was a long-term dream, something to build toward, but having that future goal gave their daily work purpose and direction. Lucy grew from an infant into a toddler, her personality emerging in delightful ways. She was fearless and curious, always exploring, always laughing. She called Ethan Papa and Clara Mama, with no awareness that their family had begun in anything but the most conventional way. To her, they were simply her parents, and the love between them was the only reality she knew. And slowly, carefully, Clara and Ethan's partnership deepened into something more. It happened in small moments. Clara reaching for Ethan's hand during an evening walk, Ethan kissing her forehead when he left for work, quiet conversations late at night where they shared dreams and fears and the mundane details of their days. There was no dramatic declaration, no single moment where everything changed, just a gradual weaving together of two lives into something unified and strong. 6 months after the confrontation with Marcus, on a spring evening warm with promise, Clara initiated their first real kiss. It was gentle and tentative, both of them learning each other carefully. When they pulled apart, Clara was crying. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked, concerned. "I'm happy," Clara said, wonder in her voice. "I'm actually happy, and I forgot what that felt like." They took things slowly, respecting Clara's pace and her lingering fears. But bit by bit, touch by touch, they built physical intimacy alongside their emotional connection. And when they finally consummated their marriage, nearly 8 months after the wedding, it was tender and mutual, and nothing like the violence Clara had known with Marcus. Afterward, lying in Ethan's arms in the darkness of their bedroom, Clara spoke the truth she'd been afraid to say. "I love you," she whispered. "I didn't think I could, but I do." "I love you, Ethan Cole." "Ah, I love you too," Ethan said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "Have for a while now, I think. Just didn't want to rush you by saying it." "You can say it now," Clara said. "Say it as often as you want. I'm ready to hear it." A year after Ethan had found them in the grass, the Cole family had grown roots so deep that Marcus's shadow had finally faded entirely. They'd purchased 20 acres and began building a house. Nothing grand, but solid and theirs. Clara's school had 15 students and a waiting list. Lucy was walking and talking and filling their days with joy. And Ethan had transformed from a drifting cowboy into a husband and father who couldn't imagine any other life. They were sitting on the porch of their new house one evening, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, when a rider approached. For a moment, old fears flickered, but the rider was just delivering mail. Among the letters was one from Brennan with important news. "Marcus Whitmore died last month," Ethan read aloud. "Pneumonia, apparently. His lawyers contacted me to confirm that his estate makes no claim on Lucy or you. You're free, legally and finally." Clara was quiet for a long moment, processing. Ethan watched her carefully, trying to gauge her reaction. "I should feel something," Clara said finally. "Relief, or vindication, or maybe even sadness. But I just feel nothing. Like he was already dead to me, and this just makes it official." "That's fair," Ethan said. "He was never really a part of Lucy's life anyway. Just a biological fact, not a father." "No," Clara agreed. "You're her father. In every way that matters, you're her father." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower. Lucy was inside napping, soon to wake for dinner. The prairie stretched around them, the same prairie where this had all begun with a baby's cry and a cowboy's choice to stop. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked suddenly. "Giving up your freedom, tying yourself to a woman with so many problems?" Ethan pulled her closer, his arm around her shoulders. "Not once. Not for a single second. You and Lucy are the best thing that ever happened to me. Before you, I was just drifting, existing but not really living. Now I have purpose, partnership, love. Everything I didn't even know I was missing." "We were so broken when you found us," Clara said softly. "Both of us, in different ways. I never thought we'd be whole again." "Maybe we're not whole," Ethan said. "Maybe we're still healing, still learning, but we're healing together, and that makes all the difference." A cry came from inside, Lucy waking up. Clara started to rise, but Ethan stopped her. "I'll get her. You stay here and enjoy the sunset." He found Lucy standing in her crib, arms outstretched, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Papa?" "Hey, little one," he said, scooping her up. "Good nap?" Lucy babbled something incomprehensible but enthusiastic, and Ethan carried her back to the porch. Clara's face softened, as it always did when she saw them together, and she opened her arms for Lucy to transfer to her lap. "We're going to have to add another room soon," Clara said, bouncing Lucy gently. "This house is already feeling small." "Another room?" Ethan asked. Clara met his eyes, a small smile playing at her lips. "I'm pregnant. About 2 months, I think. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Ethan felt like the breath had been knocked out of him. "Pregnant? We're going to have another baby?" "If you're happy about it," Clara said, suddenly uncertain. "I know we didn't plan—" "Happy?" Ethan laughed, joy bubbling up inside him. "Clara, I'm thrilled. Absolutely thrilled." He pulled her and Lucy into a careful embrace, mindful of the new life growing inside her. "When?" "Late autumn," Morrison thinks. "Right around Lucy's 2nd birthday." They sat there together, a family expanding in all the ways that mattered. 2 years ago, Ethan had been a lone cowboy with no ties and no purpose. Now he was a husband, a father, soon to be a father twice over. He had a home, a community, a future that stretched out bright with possibility. "What should we name the baby?" Clara asked. "If it's a girl, maybe Grace," Ethan suggested, "for the grace that brought us together. And if it's a boy," Ethan thought for a moment, "Cole Jr. So there's no doubt he's mine, fully mine, from the start." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You really see them as yours, don't you? Lucy and this new baby, not my children that you're taking care of, but yours." "They are mine," Ethan said simply, "just like you're mine and I'm yours. We're a family, Clara. Built from broken pieces maybe, but still a family." The sun finally set, painting the sky in deep purples and indigos. Stars began emerging, the same stars that had witnessed their journey from strangers to partners to lovers to this moment of complete belonging. "Tell me again," Clara said softly, "about the day you found us." It had become something of a ritual between them, this retelling. Ethan settled back, Lucy drowsing on Clara's lap, and began the story they both knew by heart. "I was riding to Elkhorn Ridge to collect wages from a cattle drive. It was hot, miserable, and I was thinking about heading north to Montana for new work. Then I heard this sound cutting through the wind, a baby crying. At first I thought it was a bird, but something made me investigate." He told the story the way he always did, emphasizing the moment he'd found them, the desperate ride to town, the fear that he might lose them before he'd even really found them. Clara listened with her eyes closed, one hand on Lucy, the other holding Ethan's, anchoring herself to this present reality. "And when I picked Lucy up," Ethan continued, "when I wrapped her in my coat and she grabbed my thumb with that tiny hand, something shifted in me. I knew my life had just changed in ways I couldn't understand yet. I was right, but I never could have imagined how much better that change would make everything." "Do you think it was fate?" Clara asked. "That you were meant to be riding through that exact spot at that exact moment?" "I don't know about fate," Ethan said honestly, "but I know I'm grateful for every choice that led me there. Every job I took, every town I drifted through, every decision that put me on that particular road on that particular day, because it brought me to you." Lucy had fallen asleep against Clara's chest, and Clara's own eyes were growing heavy. Ethan gathered them both up, his wife, his daughter, his growing family, and carried them inside to the bedroom they'd built together. As he settled them into bed, Clara reached for his hand one more time. "Thank you," she whispered, "for stopping that day, for every day since, for building this life with me." "Thank you for letting me," Ethan whispered back, "for trusting me enough to try." He lay down beside them, Clara's head on his shoulder. Lucy curled between them and felt the absolute rightness of this moment. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and wild, the same prairie that had nearly claimed their lives. But inside this small house they'd built together, there was warmth and safety and love. The journey from that desperate cry in the grass to this moment of perfect domestic peace had been anything but smooth. There had been fear and violence, legal battles and confrontations, moments when everything seemed lost. But they'd fought through it all together, building something stronger than either of them could have created alone. Marcus was gone. His shadow finally lifted. The legal battles were won. The threats had faded. And what remained was this: A family forged in crisis, but sustained by choice, by daily decisions to choose each other, to build together, to love, despite and because of all they'd been through. Ethan's last conscious thought before sleep claimed him was of that baby's cry cutting through the wind, calling him to a destiny he'd never imagined but couldn't imagine living without. One choice to stop and help had transformed 3 broken lives into one whole family. That was grace indeed. The story that had begun with desperate cries in the Dakota grass ended here, in a warm bed in a house they'd built themselves, with a family growing in love and size, with a future bright with possibility. It was an ending that felt like a beginning, a resolution that promised continued growth, a peace earned through struggle and sustained by commitment. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the prairie once more, Ethan Cole would wake as he did every morning now, not as a drifting cowboy, but as a husband and father, surrounded by the family he'd chosen and who had chosen him back. It was, he thought, as sleep finally took him, the best possible outcome of the worst possible circumstances. Their story was complete, but their life together was just beginning, and that made all the difference.